Hey you. Yes, you, the one who just got comfortable. Maybe you pulled up the blanket a little, dimmed the screen just enough, and decided that tonight you wanted something more than scrolling through noise. Good call. Welcome back, friend. Or if this is your first time here, welcome home. Picture a city. Not a postcard city. Not the Paris of cafe tables and golden afternoon light. I want you to picture a city in the dead of winter. 1788. The worst winter France had seen in almost a century. The Seine River frozen solid. Crops rotted in the fields before anyone could harvest them. And in the narrow, winding streets of Paris, over 600,000 people woke up every morning not knowing if there would be bread. Not enough bread. Not cheaper bread. No bread. And here is the thing no one tells you in the history books. The thing that makes this whole story human instead of just historical. The people of Paris did not hate their king because they were radicals. They did not march and riot because they had read philosophy pamphlets over fine wine. They did it because they were hungry. And they had been hungry for a very, very long time. Now, before we go any deeper into this story, let me ask you something. If this kind of storytelling is your thing, history that feels less like a lecture and more like sitting round a fire at midnight, then would you consider doing something small for me? Hit subscribe if you have not already. Leave a like if this feels like the kind of story worth saving. And if you want to tell me where in the world you're watching this from tonight, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. Alright, go ahead and dim the lights just a little more. Let that soft background sound do its thing. Because tonight we're going somewhere that most people think they already know, and discovering that they knew almost nothing at all. Let us start not with a revolution, but with a palace. Versailles. If you have ever seen photographs, and honestly, even photographs do not do it justice, it is obscene in the best possible way. The Hall of Mirrors alone has 357 mirrors reflecting 17 arched windows that open onto the most manicured gardens in Europe. At its peak, the palace employed nearly 10,000 servants. 10,000. Just to keep one family comfortable. King Louis XVI woke up every morning to a ceremony called the Lever the Royal Rising. Dozens of noblemen lined up for the privilege of watching him get dressed. There was an official whose only job was to hand the king his right sleeve first. Someone else handled the left. Another man, a duke, mind you. An actual duke was responsible for the royal napkin at breakfast. And somewhere 30 miles away in Paris, a woman named Marie, let us call her that, because she represents thousands like her, was grinding dried bean husks into powder to stretch what little flour she had left. That distance, 30 miles a world apart, is where this story begins. But here is what makes the French Revolution different from every other collapse of power in history. It was not just poverty that broke France. England had poverty. Russia had poverty. Half of Europe had poverty and managed to keep its kings. What broke France was something more dangerous than hunger. It was the feeling, slow-growing unstoppable, that things did not have to be this way. And that feeling had a name. Several names, actually. Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu. These were not just writers. They were the architects of a new idea that the natural state of a human being was not to kneel. That governments existed to serve people, not the other way around. That the words liberty and equality were not just pretty sounds, they were rights. Inalienable ones. By 1789, those ideas had been circulating in Paris for decades. In coffee houses, in pamphlets, in whispered conversations over shared meals. They had crossed the Atlantic and helped birth a new republic in America. And the French soldiers who fought in that revolution came home with something more dangerous than battle scars. They came home with proof that it was possible. So when the winter of 1788 stripped Paris to the bone, the city did not just suffer. It asked a question. Why? Why do we suffer while they feast? Why does a man born into the right family get to eat while a man born into the wrong one starves? Why is a powdered wig worth more than a child's dinner? And that question, once it is out in the air of a city of 600,000, does not go back inside. Now I want you to imagine the specific morning of May 5th, 1789. The Estates General is meeting at Versailles. This is essentially the French Parliament, except it has not been called together in 175 years. 175 years. Which tells you something about how interested French kings had been in listening to their people. Louis XVI called it because France was quite literally bankrupt. The country had spent fortunes, borrowed fortunes, helping the Americans fight the British. The royal court burned through money like a fireplace burns through paper. And now, with empty treasuries and a starving population, the king needed to figure out how to raise taxes. The representatives arrived in 3 groups called estates. The first estate was the clergy, the church, powerful and rich. The second estate was the nobility, the aristocrats, also powerful, also rich, and also deeply committed to paying as few taxes as possible. And then there was the third estate, which was everyone else. Roughly 97% of France, merchants, lawyers, farmers, tradespeople. The woman grinding bean husks into flour, the man sharpening knives for a living, every ordinary human being in the country. And under the rules of the Estates General, all 3 groups got 1 vote each. So the 97% had the same voice as a clergy of a few thousand. The third estate looked at that math and said absolutely not. What happened next unfolded over weeks, then months, gathering speed like a stone rolling downhill slowly at first, then all at once. The Third Estate broke away and declared themselves the National Assembly. When they arrived to hold their meeting on June 20th, they found the doors locked. Whether it was a deliberate provocation or just a scheduling mix-up, historians still argue about. This does not matter. What matters is what they did next. They walked to a nearby tennis court, an indoor tennis court, and in that echoing, slightly undignified space they made an oath. They swore they would not disband until France had a constitution, until the people, the actual breathing, suffering people, had a document that protected them. The Tennis Court Oath. June 20th, 1789. It sounds almost comical. A bunch of men in breeches and frock coats swearing on a tennis court. But do not let the setting fool you. In terms of defiance, it was everything. They were telling the king directly, you do not own us anymore. We are not asking, we are deciding. Louis XVI, and I want to be fair to him here because history has not always been, was not a monster. He was not cruel by nature. He was by most accounts a man who genuinely wanted to do right by his people. He was kind to his servants. He liked making locks. He had a workshop where he spent hours tinkering with mechanisms, which is a very relatable hobby, and also a slightly unfortunate metaphor for a king who could not figure out how to keep his own country from falling apart. He was not malicious. He was indecisive. And in 1789, indecision was the most dangerous thing a king of France could be. Because outside the palace walls, Paris was not waiting anymore. On July 14th, 1789, a crowd gathered outside the Bastille. The Bastille was a fortress, a royal prison, and in the popular imagination it had become the symbol of everything wrong with the old order. Royal tyranny made physical all stone and shadow and locked doors. The crowd that showed up that morning was not led by philosophers. They were led by fear and fury, and an urgent practical need. They believed weapons were stored inside and they wanted them. What happened over the next hours was chaotic and bloody. The garrison defending the Bastille held out for hours before the governor surrendered. And when the fortress finally fell, do you know how many prisoners the liberators found inside? 7. 7 prisoners. One of them was a man who'd been locked up at his own family's request for erratic behaviour. Another was a forger. None of them were political prisoners. None of them were particularly grateful. The symbol was almost entirely empty. But here is the extraordinary haunting thing: it did not matter. The Bastille fell and Paris erupted, not because of what was inside that fortress, but because of what its fall meant. That the unbreakable could be broken, that the untouchable could be touched. When the news reached Versailles, a nobleman reportedly whispered to the king, "Sire, it is a revolt." And Louis XVI, who liked making locks, looked up and said, "No, Is it a revolution? And standing in the rubble of that summer, the air smelling of gunpowder and old stone and something else, something electric and terrifying, Paris did not feel like a city that had won. It felt like a city that had just realized it was capable of anything, which, as it turns out, is the most dangerous feeling in the world, because capability without wisdom is not freedom. It is a loaded weapon with no safety. And Paris, brilliant, hungry, furious Paris, was about to pull the trigger. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part they never put in the textbooks. The women who actually changed everything with their bare hands and their rage and their 12-mile walk through the mud. The moment the revolution stopped being about ideas and became something far more personal. That story's waiting right on the other side of this moment. There is a particular kind of tragedy that history keeps repeating, and it goes something like this. A great house stands for generations. It weathers storms. It outlasts enemies. People walk past it every day and think without really thinking it, that it will always be there. And then one season, one bad, quiet, unremarkable season, a crack appears in the foundation. Not dramatic, not loud, just a crack. And everyone looks the other way because the house has survived worse, until it hasn't. That is the story of the French monarchy in the years leading up to 1789. Not a sudden collapse, a slow, patient unraveling. And the tragedy is not that no one saw it coming. The tragedy is that several people saw it coming very clearly, and the one man with the power to stop it simply could not bring himself to act. Let me introduce you to that man properly. Louis XVI became King of France in May of 1774 at the age of 19 years old. And his first reaction upon learning he was now responsible for the most powerful monarchy in Europe was not confidence, not ambition, it was a prayer. He reportedly sank to his knees with his young wife Marie Antoinette and said out loud, "God guide us and protect us. We are too young to reign." That line has haunted historians ever since, because it was honest. It was self-aware in a way that was almost painful, and it turned out to be perfectly tragically accurate. Here is what we know about Louis XVI as a person stripped of all the political noise. He was by genuine accounts kind, warm with his children, devoted to his faith. He genuinely cared about the well-being of ordinary people, not as subjects to be managed, but as human beings. He could speak fluent English and Italian. He was fascinated by geography and science. He personally translated and annotated the journals of the English explorer James Cook, which is admittedly the most charming fact about any French monarch I have ever come across. And he was obsessed with locksmithing, not metaphorically, literally. He had a forge in the palace and spent hours, sometimes whole days, crafting intricate lock mechanisms with his hands. There is something quietly devastating about that detail if you sit with it for a moment. Here was a man who could design a system of pins and levers and springs, something precise and logical, something that worked but could not, for the life of him, figure out how to run a country. He was, as one historian put it with remarkable kindness, a man ideally suited to a private life. He had been raised for a throne he was never supposed to inherit. His older brother, the one actually trained to be king, died of tuberculosis at the age of 9. And so the shy, quiet boy who preferred his workshop suddenly found himself wearing a crown in front of a kingdom of 28 million people. No one briefed him on the debt. Oh, the debt. Let us talk about the debt, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating and a little darkly funny if you appreciate the kind of humour that comes with watching very rich people make spectacularly bad financial decisions. France in the mid-1700s was not poor. Let me be clear about that. It was in fact one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Fertile land, thriving trade, a population growing faster than any other major European nation. Between 1715 and 1789. France grew from 21 million people to 28 million. The middle class had tripled in size. There was real prosperity in this country, but the money flowing into the royal treasury bore absolutely no resemblance to the money flowing out of it. The first wound was the 7 Years' War, a brutal globe-spanning conflict fought from 1756 to 1763, which France lost badly. It drained the treasury and stripped France of nearly all its territories in North America. The French called it a humiliation, and humiliated nations have a tendency to look for revenge, which is exactly what happened. When the American colonies rose up against Britain in 1775, France saw an opportunity it simply could not resist. France poured money ships, soldiers and supplies into supporting the American Revolution, not out of love for democracy, let us be honest about that, but out of love for watching England suffer. The Marquis de Lafayette-Rochambeau, the entire French Atlantic Fleet, billions of modern dollars worth of military support. And it worked. Britain lost. The United States was born. France celebrated. France was also quietly now nearly bankrupt. The royal finances for 1788 tell the story with brutal clarity. The government expected to bring in 503 million livres that year. It expected to spend 629 million. That is a gap of 126 million livres, and that gap had to be filled with loans at high interest rates, which created a larger gap the following year, which required more loans, which created an even larger gap. You see where this is going. By the late 1780s, more than half of every livre collected in taxes went directly to paying interest on previous debts. Half. Before a single road was repaired, before a single soldier was paid, before a single candle was lit in a government building, half the money was already gone, vanished into the accounts of France's creditors. Now here is where a reasonable person might ask, why not just raise taxes? And that question opens a door into something that made ordinary French people, when they understood it, genuinely furious. France had a tax system, a complicated, labyrinthine, almost surreal tax system with different rules in different regions and different exemptions for different groups. But the fundamental logic of it, if you could call it logic, was this: the people who had the least paid the most. The first estate, the clergy controlled roughly 6 to 10% of all the land in France. They paid no direct taxes to the crown. Instead, they made a voluntary gift to the state every few years, which they negotiated themselves and which amounted to a tiny fraction of what any fair assessment would have required of them. The second estate, the nobility owned about a quarter of the land. They were exempt from the most burdensome direct taxes, including the tille, which was the primary tax on income and property. Whatever modest contributions they made were diluted by so many exemptions and privileges that the practical burden was almost negligible. The third estate, which was again 97% of the country, paid all of it. The taille, the gabelle, which was a tax on salt, a daily necessity, set at wildly different rates across different regions in a way that seemed almost designed to be confusing. The corvée, which required peasants to provide free labour on roads, feudal dues owed to local lords, church tithes, and then direct taxes on top of all of that. There is a famous political cartoon from 1789 that tells this story better than any paragraph I could write. It shows a hunched, exhausted peasant carrying 2 men on his back, a fat nobleman and a plump bishop, while trying to walk through a field of thorns. The peasant is barefoot, and at the bottom the caption reads simply, "I knew it would come to this." That cartoon was not radical art. It was a mirror. So why did the nobility block reform, even when reform was clearly the only thing standing between France and total collapse? This is the part that requires a little psychological honesty about how human beings actually work, as opposed to how we like to think they work. Louis XVI had talented ministers, genuinely talented. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, appointed in 1774, was one of the most brilliant economic minds of the age. His plan was elegant in its directness: abolish the monopolies choking French commerce, remove the grain trade restrictions that were artificially raising bread prices, and most controversially extend direct taxation to the nobility and clergy. No bankruptcy, no new taxes on the poor, no fresh borrowing. Just making the people who had avoided paying finally pay their share. The nobility refused. The Parlement's regional courts, controlled almost entirely by noble families, blocked Turgot's reforms before they could take effect. Within 2 years, Turgot was gone. Then came Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker, who was perhaps the most creative of the finance ministers. In one very specific way, he hid the problem. In 1781, Necker published something called the Compte Rendu au Roi, essentially the first public accounting of royal finances in French history. It was beautifully produced. It was also, historians later discovered, almost entirely fictional. Necker presented the crown as running a modest surplus. The reality was a deficit of perhaps 70 to 80 million livres. He massaged the numbers to exclude war costs and keep public confidence from collapsing. He resigned when the court found out he was also telling the truth to the king. Then Charles-Alexandre de Calonne arrived from 1783 onwards, and Calonne took a fascinatingly different approach. He spent more money. The idea was to stimulate the economy and borrow against future growth. It looked good for a few years. Then it looked catastrophic. By August of 1786, Calonne sat down with Louis XVI and told him something that no minister had managed to say out loud. In quite so direct a fashion, France was not on the brink of bankruptcy. France was already there. The only solution, Calonne said, was a universal land tax, one that applied to everyone: clergy, nobility, commoners, the king himself. No exemptions, no exceptions. The Assembly of Notables, summoned to approve this reform in 1787, looked at the proposal, looked at each other and declined. Politely, with great ceremony, but firmly, they declined to tax themselves to save the country they were running. I want to pause there because I think that moment deserves to sit for just a second. These were not stupid men. They understood that France was in crisis. They understood what Calonne was telling them. They made a calculation, whether consciously or instinctively, that their own privilege mattered more than the stability of the system that privilege depended on. It is a calculation that powerful people have made throughout history. It rarely ends well for anyone. Meanwhile, outside the gilded rooms where ministers argued and nobles deliberated, ordinary life in France was deteriorating in ways that numbers cannot fully capture. The economic recession that had set in after 1785 was grinding. Unemployment in Paris had climbed sharply. The winters of 1787 and 1788 were savage crops. Failed rivers froze, livestock died. In the summer of 1788, a freak hailstorm swept across northern France and destroyed almost the entire harvest in some regions. Wheat prices spiked to levels that meant a working family might spend 80 to 90% of its income on bread alone. Not food, just bread. In some neighbourhoods of Paris, people were surviving on what the French grimly called famine bread loaves made with ground bean husks, bran even sawdust mixed with whatever grain remained dense and grey and bitter. And this was not the countryside. This was the capital city. Here's what I find most striking about this period, and what I think gets lost when we look at the French Revolution from a distance. The people who eventually rose up had been remarkably patient. For decades, for generations, they had paid their taxes, performed their labour obligations, endured the grain shortages and the salt taxes and the feudal dues, and the 1,000 small indignities of a system designed to keep them at the bottom. They had not been passive because they were content. They had been patient because they believed on some level that the system would eventually correct itself, that the king would listen, that reform would come. By 1788, that belief was gone. There is a question worth asking here, and feel free to sit with it, because I think about it more than I probably should. How many warning signs does a system need to produce before the people inside it acknowledge that the system itself is the problem? France had 3 brilliant finance ministers in 12 years. All 3 of them independently reached the same conclusion: the tax exemptions for the nobility and clergy had to end. All 3 of them were dismissed, discredited, or forced to resign. The message to every subsequent minister was obvious: tell the king the truth and you will lose your job. It is not unique to France. It is not unique to the 18th century. Historians have a term for it: structural dysfunction, but I think very expensive stubbornness works equally well. The tragedy of Louis XVI is not that he was cruel. It is that he was genuinely good in all the ways that do not require courage. He was kind. He was well-meaning. He wanted France to be better. But when faced with the choice between supporting a minister and losing the goodwill of the court, between structural reform and personal comfort, he chose the easier path. Every single time. Until there were no easier paths left. By autumn of 1788, France was approaching what its own finance ministers privately called a complete exhaustion of credit. The government could not borrow more, it could not raise taxes fast enough, and it could not or would not touch the wealth of the people who had wealth to spare. The only option remaining was to call the Estates General into session for the first time in 175 years and ask the French people politely if they would consider maybe fixing things. You already know from what we explored earlier how that conversation went, but what you might not fully appreciate yet is the specific, quiet, devastating moment when Louis XVI read the cahiers de doléances, the notebooks of grievances that ordinary French people submitted ahead of the Estates General. Thousands of them from villages and towns across the country. People describing in their own words what their lives actually felt like. A shoemaker in Lyon writing that his children had not tasted meat in 4 months. A farmer in Brittany calculating that after all his taxes and feudal payments, he kept less than 1/5 of what his land produced. A widow in Normandy asking simply why the church owned so much land and paid so little to feed the poor. Louis read them, he was moved by them, and then he had dinner at Versailles. That gap between being moved and being changed, between feeling compassion and taking action, is the fault line that runs through the entire collapse of the French monarchy. And the fault line was about to crack open wide. Because while the king dined and the nobles debated and the ministers drafted proposals that would never be enacted, something was shifting in the streets of Paris that no one in Versailles had quite accounted for. The people were not just hungry anymore, they were organized. And one of the most extraordinary things about what came next, the part that surprises almost everyone when they learn it properly, is who organized them first. It was not philosophers. It was not lawyers. It was not the educated men of the bourgeoisie who'd been reading Rousseau in warm coffee houses. It was a group of women who had had enough. Stay with me, because the story of what those women did on a cold October morning in 1789 is one of the most astonishing and least told chapters in this entire revolution. Something strange happens when you look closely at the most famous moments in history. They almost never are what we think they are. We build monuments to them, name holidays after them, teach them to children as simple, clean stories of courage and defiance. And somewhere underneath all of that, the messier, stranger, more interesting truth quietly waits for someone to actually look. July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. If you grew up in any Western country, you probably know the basic shape of this story-oppressed people rise up storm. A fortress of tyranny, free the prisoners and launch a revolution. Beautiful, heroic, and about half true. Let us talk about what actually happened. 2 days before the Bastille fell, something else happened first, and almost no one outside of France knows this detail. On the evening of July 11th, 1789, King Louis XVI made what historians now consider one of the single worst political decisions of his reign. He dismissed Jacques Necker. You remember Necker, the Swiss banker, the finance minister, the man who'd become something close to a beloved public figure among ordinary Parisians because he at least seemed to be on their side. Whatever his flaws, and he had many, including a talent for creative accounting that would impress modern hedge fund managers, the people trusted him. He was the face of reform. He was in their minds the thin line between a government that might still listen and a government that had decided to simply crush them. When news of Necker's dismissal reached Paris on the afternoon of July 12th, the city did not take it quietly. Within hours something crystallized. A rumour spread, and this matters because it was almost certainly false, but entirely understandable, that the king was moving thousands of foreign troops, Swiss and German mercenaries, into Paris. The story went that these soldiers, who owed no loyalty to the French people, were being positioned to massacre the reformers, silence the National Assembly, and roll back everything that had been gained. The whisper that ran through the streets was chilling. They're going to do to us what was done to the Huguenots, a reference most Parisians would have known in their bones. More than a century earlier, thousands of Protestant citizens had been slaughtered in their homes in a single terrible night. The memory lived in the culture the way certain fears always do, not as history but as possibility. Into this atmosphere on a Sunday afternoon at the Palais Royal walked a 26-year-old journalist named Camille Desmoulins. Desmoulins was by his own admission not a natural public speaker. He had a stammer. He was broke, genuinely scraping the bottom of the barrel, broke, having tried and failed to establish himself as a lawyer in Paris, because he could not afford the connections that success required. He had been writing radical pamphlets that printers kept refusing to publish. He was in the most honest assessment, a young man with a lot of words and nowhere particularly useful to put them. On July 12th, the Palais Royal, a garden and shopping arcade owned by the Duke of Orleans, who had deliberately opened it to public gatherings as a thumb in the eye of the crown, was packed. 10,000 people, some accounts say. The news about Necker was circulating. The fear about foreign troops was spreading, and Desmoulins, in a moment that would define his entire life, jumped onto a table outside a café. He pulled a green leaf from one of the chestnut trees lining the garden. He held it up as a cockade, a symbol of hope, he said, because green was the colour of hope. And he shouted, his stammer apparently forgotten in the adrenaline of the moment, something along the lines of, "Citizens, there is no time to lose. The dismissal of Necker is the death knell for patriots. Tonight the foreign battalions will leave the Champ de Mars to massacre us all. There is only one option left: to arms." That speech lit Paris like a matchlight's dry paper. Within 2 days, a fortress that had stood for more than 4 centuries was in the hands of the people. Now, here is the part that everyone skips. Why the Bastille specifically? The honest answer is gunpowder. The day before the storming, the crowd had already broken into the Hôtel des Invalides, a military veterans complex on the other side of the city, and helped themselves to approximately 28,000 muskets, which is by any measure an impressive haul, but muskets without powder and shot are very expensive clubs. A few days earlier, the royal governor had transferred 250 barrels of gunpowder to the Bastille for safekeeping, and so the crowd, freshly armed and needing ammunition, headed east toward that dark 8-towered fortress on the edge of the old city. This was not a poetic pilgrimage to the Temple of Tyranny. It was a practical procurement mission with excellent narrative timing. The Bastille was defended by 82 veteran soldiers, older men invalides, as the French called them, no longer fit for regular service, and 32 Swiss grenadiers who had arrived just a week earlier as reinforcements. The governor, a man named Bernard-René de Launay, had been born inside the Bastille itself. His father had been the previous governor, and the family had essentially lived in the fortress for 2 generations. He was by contemporary accounts a conscientious if somewhat rigid man who found himself in an impossible situation. Delaunay did not want to fight. He negotiated for hours, sending delegates back and forth trying to find terms that would allow him to surrender the powder without anyone dying. At some point the exact sequence is still disputed. Someone lowered a drawbridge or someone fired first, or the crowd simply surged forward and 4 hours of fighting followed that left 94 attackers and 1 defender dead. Then de Launay raised a white flag. The fortress fell at around 5 in the evening, and here is where history gets strange and revealing all at once. The crowd swept through the gates, they searched the towers, they unlocked the cells, they found 7 prisoners. 7. 4 of them were forgers, common criminals arrested through the ordinary courts, nothing political about their imprisonment whatsoever. 2 were described in the records as mentally ill. One was an Irishman named James White, whose own family had requested his confinement, and the last was an aristocrat called the Comte de Solage, locked up by his own father for behaviour the family apparently found too embarrassing to tolerate. Incidentally, and this detail is almost too perfect, the Bastille's most famous prisoner, the Marquis de Sade, that extraordinary and profoundly disturbing nobleman, whose name eventually became a word in the English language, had been transferred to an insane asylum 10 days earlier. His offence had been leaning out his window and screaming to passers-by that the prisoners were being massacred inside and that they needed to come and free them, which was not true. But it was the kind of statement that in the summer of 1789 carried a certain resonance. So the liberators of the Bastille found 4 forgers, 2 madmen, and a disgraced aristocrat. Not a single political prisoner. Not one. The dungeon was empty. The torture chambers, which the popular press had been writing horror stories about for decades, feeding a profitable public appetite for prison literature, did not really exist in any active form. Under Louis XVI, the darkest cells had not been in regular use for years. In fact, the government had already been in discussions about whether to close the Bastille entirely and replace it with a public park. The cost of maintaining a medieval fortress for 7 prisoners and a garrison of aging soldiers was by any rational accounting absurd. So what exactly did Paris celebrate on the evening of July 14th? That question has occupied historians ever since, and I think the most honest answer is both simple and profound. They celebrated an idea. The Bastille was not important because of the people it held. It was important because of what it represented: the system of lettres de cachet royal orders that could imprison anyone at any time for any reason or no reason, without trial, without appeal, without a stated end date. Former inmates had been writing vivid memoirs about their time inside for a generation. Some of those accounts were exaggerated, some were plainly fictionalized. But they tapped into something real, the knowledge carried by every person in France, that the king had the legal power to take you in the night and put you somewhere no one would ever find you. The Bastille was that power made visible. 8 stone towers, thick walls, and no way in or out unless the crown permitted it. Knocking it down was not about the 7 men inside. It was about everyone outside who had always known somewhere in the back of their minds that such a place existed and that they had no protection from it. I find that enormously moving, actually. The most famous symbol of the French Revolution was largely empty. And it did not matter, because what people were storming was not a building, it was a feeling. What happened to the Bastille after its fall is, if anything, even more interesting. The very next day, July 15th, 1789, a demolition contractor named Pierre-François Palloy arrived with a work crew and started taking the fortress apart stone by stone. He was by all accounts a spectacular opportunist, with an instinct for the market that would make any modern entrepreneur quietly envious. Within months he had sold the stones as souvenirs carved into miniature Bastille replicas, turned into jewellery, fashioned into medallions distributed across France and beyond as physical relics of the revolution's birth moment. He reportedly sent 83 miniature stone Bastilles, one to each department in France, as gifts. The clock from the Bastille, which had depicted prisoners in chains, was melted down. 4 statues were destroyed. Within 5 months, one of the most formidable military fortresses in France had been entirely disassembled by ordinary workers, its stones scattered across the country as souvenirs. Some of those stones ended up in the bridge across the Seine now called the Pont de la Concorde. Parisians, it was said, would walk across the bridge of the old regime without even noticing, and Delaunay Governor Delaunay, who had tried to negotiate, who had surrendered rather than blow up the fortress and the surrounding neighbourhood, who'd done perhaps the most humane thing available to him, under the circumstances was taken under guard toward the Hôtel de Ville to be tried by a revolutionary council. He never made it. The crowd seized him along the way. He shouted reportedly that he'd had enough and wanted to die, and then kicked a pastry cook named Doulate in a place that ensured things would turn violent rather quickly. He was stabbed repeatedly and died in the street. His head, along with that of a municipal official named Jacques de Flesselles, who had been accused of treachery, was raised on a pike and paraded through the streets of Paris. An English doctor named Edward Rigby, who happened to be visiting and witnessed this, wrote afterward, "We perceived 2 bloody heads raised on pikes. It was a chilling and a horrid sight. It was both of those things, and it was also in its brutal way a preview of what was coming. Because the revolution had just discovered something about itself, something it would not fully reckon with until it was far too late. It had discovered that collective anger, once it is given permission, does not ask for credentials before it acts." There is a lesson buried in all of this that I keep coming back to, and it is not the comfortable kind. We tend to tell ourselves that revolutions happen because people finally see clearly, because the truth breaks through, because justice demands it, because history reaches a natural turning point, and sometimes that is part of it. But the Bastille also tells a different story about how symbols can matter more than realities, about how rumours spread faster than facts in a frightened crowd, about how the most powerful political acts are sometimes launched, not toward what is actually there, but toward what people believe is there. The Bastille was nearly empty. The torture chambers were largely myths. The Crown had already planned to knock the building down. None of that dimmed the revolution's fire by a single degree, because the fire was never really about the Bastille. It was about everything that had built up behind it, every unfair tax, every hungry winter, every aristocrat who paid nothing and laughed about it, every letter that could vanish a person without explanation, every finance minister dismissed for telling the truth, every grinding year of a system that treated 97% of the country as a resource to be extracted rather than a people to be served. The Bastille was just the door through which all of that finally walked, and once it walked through there was no calling it back. In the days and weeks after the 14th of July, something remarkable happened across France. The news travelled, word-of-mouth pamphlets, riders on horseback, and as it spread, something the historians call the Great Fear swept across the countryside, peasants rising up against their landlords, burning feudal records, refusing to pay the dues they owed. Not because they had heard a coordinated signal, but because the fall of the Bastille had sent a message that travelled faster than any newspaper the old world could be broken. The question was what would be built in its place, and that it turned out was the harder question, because breaking things is relatively easy once you have enough people who have had enough. The building the other kind, the kind made of laws and institutions and the complicated business of actually governing 28 million people, who all want different things. That is where revolutions go to test themselves. And the women of Paris who had marched to Versailles just weeks later in mud and rain understood this in a way that surprises me even now, centuries on. That story is where we're going next, and it is one of the most extraordinary things I've ever come across in all my time reading about this revolution. Close your eyes for just a second and picture this. A cold Tuesday morning in early October. The year is 1789. The air in Paris smells of wood smoke and rain. A woman, let us call her what she likely was, a fish seller, a poissarde, the kind of woman who has spent every morning of her working life standing in an open-air market hollering prices over the noise of 1,000 other voices, arrives at her stall in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine in the eastern reaches of Paris and finds almost nothing to sell. Not because she did not show up, not because trade was slow, because there is no bread. Again, she's been watching the bread queues get longer for weeks. She's been watching prices climb in ways that make no sense when you know, as she knows in her bones, that grain does not simply disappear. She has 3 children at home. She has a husband who works when there is work. And she is standing in an empty market in the rain, looking at shelves that should be full, thinking a thought that is deceptively simple and absolutely explosive. This is not an accident. I want to talk about these women today. The fishwives, the laundresses, the fruit sellers, the market women of Paris, because history has spent 200 years treating them like a footnote. A colourful mob that sparked a dramatic episode and then stepped aside while the real revolution continued without them. That reading is wrong, and I think it is worth correcting properly. On the 5th of October 1789, these women did something that no army, no philosopher, no politician, no finance minister, and no amount of speechifying had managed to do in the previous 3 months of revolution. They walked 12 miles in the rain, knocked on the door of the most powerful palace in Europe, and brought the King of France home. Not figuratively, literally. They physically escorted Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette out of Versailles and back to Paris where the people could watch them. It was without exaggeration one of the most consequential acts of the entire revolution, and it began with a drum. The immediate trigger was a banquet. On the 1st of October 1789, just weeks after the Bastille had fallen, just weeks after the Declaration of the Rights of Man had been proclaimed, the officers of the King's Flanders Regiment arrived at Versailles for a welcoming dinner. The reports that filtered back to Paris described it as extravagant, food and wine in quantities that bordered on theatrical. Officers reportedly trampling on the revolutionary tricolour cockade, the red and blue symbol Parisians had adopted as their badge of the new order. Whether those reports were entirely accurate hardly mattered. What mattered was what they meant to a city where ordinary people were spending most of their income on bread that was becoming harder and harder to find. Royal soldiers feasting and mocking the revolution while Paris went hungry. The message could not have been more calculated to enrage people if it had been designed that way. It was not designed. It was just careless, which in a way is worse. By the morning of October 5th, the market districts of Paris were boiling. Thousands of women, the accounts vary, but estimates run between 6,000 and 10,000, began gathering outside the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. They were not a uniform group. There were fishwives who could outshout any man alive. There were laundresses with broad shoulders and powerful hands. There were middle-class women who'd been reading the pamphlets. There were women from the roughest streets of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine who had in many cases already been at the Bastille 3 months earlier and knew precisely what organised anger could accomplish. They were armed with the tools of their daily lives, kitchen knives, brooms, pikes, and some had found more serious weapons. They carried a drum. Several carried old muskets. They were soaking wet from the rain that had been falling since early morning and showed absolutely no intention of going home. A man named Stanislas Maillard, a veteran of the Bastille, a kind of self-appointed marshal of popular unrest, tried to channel the energy. He positioned himself at their head reportedly to keep them from burning down the city hall and to give the march some direction. He was by most accounts terrified of what might happen if no one kept these women focused, and then they started walking. 12 miles. I want you to feel that number for a moment because we tend to absorb it abstractly when we read it on a page. 12 miles in October rain on roads that were mostly unpaved mud, in the dress and shoes of women who had been working in a market since before dawn. Carrying weapons, carrying a drum, carrying the accumulated fury of months of hunger and frustration, and the specific kind of rage that comes from watching people with everything ignore people with nothing. Many of them were not young. Many were mothers who had left children at home. Some were elderly, some were pregnant. All of them were wet and cold and angry, and not one of them turned back. They passed through the gates of Versailles at around 5 in the afternoon, 6 hours of walking, 12 miles of mud, and when they arrived, the palace guards trained soldiers, men with guns and bayonets, looked at this column of wet, exhausted, furious women, and for the most part simply stepped aside. I think about that a lot. What it must have felt like from both directions. Inside the palace, Louis XVI was informed that the women of Paris had arrived. His advisers were divided, some counselled flight. Others urged him to address the crowd. Others retreated into the particular kind of paralysis that had characterized so much of his reign. He went hunting that morning, which is perhaps the most Louis XVI thing imaginable given the circumstances. When he returned to find the palace surrounded, he at least had the presence of mind to agree to meet a delegation. 6 women were admitted into the palace, led by a young woman named Louison Chabry, a sculptor's assistant, 17 years old, not a market woman, but someone swept up in the tide of the day. The delegation entered those gilded corridors past chandeliers and painted ceilings and walls lined with silk and stood before the king. Louison Chabry, 17 years old, presented the demands: bread, affordable grain, no more scarcity. The king agreed. He signed papers. He gave assurances. Louison Chabry, by some accounts, fainted. Whether from relief or from the sheer overwhelming strangeness of standing in that room, we cannot know. The delegation went back outside to report that the king had agreed to their demands. The crowd was not convinced, and this is the part that I find most politically sophisticated about these women, the part that gets completely overlooked in most accounts of this event. They did not trust the piece of paper. They did not trust the assurances. They had heard enough promises from the court to know that royal words and royal actions were two very different things. What they wanted was the king in Paris, where they could see him. The night of October 5th was uneasy in a way that no document quite captures. The crowd camped on the grounds of Versailles, soaking and shivering and refusing to leave. The Marquis de Lafayette arrived late in the evening with approximately 15,000 National Guardsmen. He'd been trying to delay the march, which earned him the crowd's fury, and announced to the king, with perhaps excessive theatre, that he had come to die at His Majesty's feet. The king appears to have found this less reassuring than Lafayette intended. An uneasy standoff settled over the palace through the small hours. Then, sometime around 6 in the morning on October 6th, the small group found an unguarded side entrance. They slipped inside and moved through the back corridors toward the Queen's chambers. Marie Antoinette was asleep. The guards outside her door spotted the intruders and fired. One young woman in the crowd was killed. The other marchers, hearing the shots, surged forward. 2 royal guards were overpowered and killed in the corridors, their heads taken, as the crowd had taken Delaunay's head at the Bastille 3 months before. Marie Antoinette woke to pounding doors and screaming voices and the sound of violence somewhere very close. She ran barefoot through the connecting rooms of the palace, those famous connecting rooms that she knew better than anyone, having lived among them for 20 years in search of her children, shouting for someone to save them. She found the door to the royal suite and hammered on it until it opened. The National Guardsmen arrived. They pulled the royal family to safety. Outside in the corridors, the heads of the 2 murdered guards were being paraded on pikes. Lafayette understood that the situation would not hold. He went to the king and said, with the kind of diplomatic clarity that tends to emerge when the alternative is catastrophe, that the only path forward was for the royal family to come to Paris. Willingly, publicly, as a gesture of unity with the people. Louis XVI agreed, but the crowd was not finished. They wanted to see the Queen. Marie Antoinette stepped onto the balcony. Imagine it! A woman who had been running for her life barefoot 6 hours earlier. A woman who knew that somewhere below the balcony the heads of 2 men who died defending her were being carried through the crowd. She walked out, made a long, low, formal bow to the mass of people gathered in the courtyard below, and stood still while the crowd roared. What they roared is not entirely clear from the historical record. Some accounts say it was approval, some say there were still threats. What is certain is that Lafayette kissed her hand, and something in the scene, the gesture, the bow, the spectacle of the Queen standing before the people instead of above them, shifted the mood enough to prevent further violence. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon of October the 6th, 1789, a procession left Versailles for Paris, the royal family in their carriage, 100 deputies of the National Assembly walking alongside, 15,000 National Guardsmen surrounding everything, and tens of thousands of wet, exhausted, triumphant Parisians leading the way, some of them still carrying those terrible pikes, some of them waving bread loaves on the ends of sticks, some of them singing. It took 6 hours to cover 12 miles. When the procession entered Paris, the crowds lining the streets reportedly shouted, "The baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy are here." Louis XVI, the most powerful monarch in Europe, had been brought home by fishwives. Now, here is what I want to sit with for a moment because I think it matters enormously. The women who marched to Versailles that day were not fighting for an abstract idea. They were not moved by pamphlets or philosophy. They were fighting for bread, for their children's breakfast, for the daily, specific, unglamorous reality of keeping a family fed in a city that was failing them. And in doing so, they accomplished something that no philosopher had they relocated the revolution. Until October the 6th, 1789, the King of France lived at Versailles. He had lived at Versailles his whole life, as his father had, as his grandfather had, all the way back to Louis XIV, who built the place as a statement of absolute power deliberately removed from Paris. Versailles was 30 miles away. It was another world. You could be the King of France and have almost no contact with the actual daily reality of the country you governed. After October 6th, Louis XVI lived in Paris. In the Tuileries Palace, a royal residence, but one surrounded by city streets visible to ordinary people reachable on foot. He was not a prisoner yet technically, but he was no longer insulated. He was no longer in his fortress of gold and mirrors surrounded by 300 servants and 14 miles of manicured garden. He was in Paris, where the revolution was. The women had not just brought bread, they had changed the geography of power. There is bitter irony at the end of this story that I cannot leave out because it says something important about how revolutions treat the people who make them. The women of Paris marched. They faced down a palace guard. They slept in rain on palace grounds. They brought a king home. And when the revolutionary government eventually got around to thinking about rights and citizenship, and who deserved to vote and participate in the new France they were building, they left the women out. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaimed in August of 1789, was exactly that. Man, Citizen, not woman. Not the fishwife who walked 12 miles in October rain. Not the laundress who arrived at Versailles with a kitchen knife and changed history. A woman named Olympe de Gouges, playwright activist daughter of a butcher, who had educated herself and made herself a political voice in a world that offered women almost none, responded in 1791 by writing the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. Article by article, she mirrored the original declaration and demanded that every right claimed for men be extended to women as well. The revolutionary government executed her in 1793. The charge was that she had overstepped, that she had meddled in politics, that women had no business in the public sphere. This was the same republic that had ridden to power on the backs of women who walked 12 miles in the rain. I think about the woman in the market who started this, the unnamed fish seller, cold and angry, staring at empty shelves. She did not know she was making history. She was just trying to feed her children in a city that kept failing to provide enough bread. She had no philosophy degree. She had no platform. She had a drum and a direction, and thousands of women around her who were just as cold and just as angry and just as unwilling to walk home empty-handed. And she changed France. History likes its revolutionaries eloquent. It likes them articulate and well-documented and preferably male. It likes them to leave speeches behind and pamphlets and portraits in powdered wigs. Most of the women who made the October March left nothing behind but the fact of what they did. Their names are mostly gone. Their faces are lost. What remains is the story itself, 12 miles, one king, and a revolution that suddenly had an address. The story of these women is also, I think, the clearest early warning of what was coming for the revolution as a whole. Because what October 1789 revealed was a gap, a growing, dangerous, eventually fatal gap between what the revolution promised and what it actually delivered. Between the language of liberty and the reality of who liberty was actually for. That gap would get larger, and the people who fell into it would not always be women. Eventually it would swallow men who had believed in the revolution since the beginning, men who had given it everything they had. One of them is worth knowing closely because his story is perhaps the most unsettling of all. A man who started as the conscience of the revolution and became slowly and then suddenly something no one who knew him in the early years could quite have predicted. His name was Maximilien Robespierre, and the version of him that history remembers is not the version he started as. Let me ask you something honest. Have you ever met someone who was absolutely, completely, unshakably convinced they were right about everything? Not arrogant exactly, not boastful, just certain. The kind of person who does not raise their voice because they do not feel the need to, because in their mind the facts speak clearly, and anyone who disagrees simply has not understood them yet. These people can be wonderful when they're arguing for something genuinely good, and they can be catastrophic when the world stops cooperating with their certainty. I've been thinking about Maximilien Robespierre for years, longer than I probably should admit. And what I keep coming back to is this. The thing that made him exceptional was exactly the same thing that made him monstrous. Not power, not ambition, not corruption. He famously rejected corruption at every turn. What made Robespierre dangerous was the absolute, almost religious conviction that he was right, and that he was the revolution. He was born on the 6th of May, 1758 in Arras, a small city in the north of France, far from the glamour of Paris, the kind of place where people worked hard and expected nothing remarkable from life. His childhood was not gentle. His mother died when he was 6 years old in childbirth, taking the baby with her. His father, a lawyer, a charming and somewhat unreliable man, dissolved shortly after. He began travelling, sending occasional letters, eventually stopping altogether. By the time Maximilien was 7 or 8, his father had effectively vanished from his life, and from France entirely. 4 children were left in the care of grandparents and aunts. Maximilian was the oldest. He was also by every account already strange, not in a cruel way, not in a troubling way, but in the manner of a child who has gone very quiet and very inward, and found something there that the noisy outside world could not touch. He read constantly. He built model chapels with careful hands. He was reported to have kept sparrows and pigeons as pets, which is a detail that I find almost unbearably humanizing given what comes later. At 11, a scholarship changed everything. He won a place at the Collège Louis le Grand in Paris, one of the most prestigious schools in France, and spent 12 years there. 12 years. He won prizes for rhetoric. He developed a deep fascination with the Roman Republic, with Cicero, with the idea of the virtuous citizen who puts the good of the whole above personal interest. He discovered Rousseau and Rousseau's idea that human beings were fundamentally good, that society had corrupted them, but that with the right institutions, the right laws, the right moral foundation, they could be redeemed. He graduated in 1780 with a 600 livres prize for 12 years of exemplary conduct. Excellent in every subject, not a single blemish on his record. He went back to Arras. He became a lawyer. And here is where the story gets interesting in ways the textbooks rarely stop to appreciate. Robespierre the lawyer was genuinely admirable. He took cases for the poor. He wrote papers attacking the arbitrary use of power by the privileged classes. He fought against the system of lettres de cachet, those same royal orders that could imprison a person without trial, without explanation, without end. He was appointed as a criminal judge in 1782 and promptly resigned because the position required him to sentence a man to death, and he found that he could not do it. Not on principle as an abstract matter, he physically could not bring himself to do it. He paced his room afterward, muttering to himself he knew the man was guilty. He knew the sentence was correct, but even so, to cause a man to die. This is not a detail that sits comfortably next to the later story of Robespierre ordering the deaths of thousands. But it is a true detail, and I think it matters. Because it tells us that what happened to Robespierre over the following decade was not a simple case of a villain pretending to be a hero. The horror is more intricate than that. The horror is that the ideals were real. The compassion was real. The man who could not sentence a murderer to death, and the man who would later sign death warrant after death warrant were the same person. And understanding that is the only way to understand how ordinary human beings can arrive at extraordinary darkness. In 1789, Robespierre travelled to Versailles as a delegate of the Third Estate. He was 30 years old, comparatively obscure, relatively poor, and despite his years of public writing and advocacy, almost entirely unknown outside of Arras. He arrived wearing a powdered wig and carefully maintained clothes that were somewhat at odds with the informal revolutionary atmosphere that was developing around the new National Assembly. He would keep wearing that wig and those knee breeches and those silk stockings long after most of his fellow Jacobins adopted the looser, more egalitarian dress of the sans-culottes. It was one of the many small signals about Robespierre that people noticed and puzzled over this fierce champion of the common people, who maintained the personal habits of a bourgeois gentleman, who kept his appearance fastidiously arranged at all times, as if a single wrinkle in his coat might be evidence of some kind of moral disorder. He gave speeches, nearly 1,000 of them over the next 5 years by some counts. Most of his early speeches were genuinely radical in the best sense of the word. He argued for universal male suffrage, the right of every man to vote regardless of wealth or property. He argued against the death penalty and did so passionately before the National Assembly in 1791. He argued for equal rights for actors, for Jews, for Protestants, for free men of colour in the colonies. For the time and place, these were not small positions. These were positions that earned him real enemies. His nickname arrived organically from the people of Paris. They called him the Incorruptible. Not because anyone formally gave him the title, because he had earned it. He lived in a rented room in a carpenter's house, the home of a man named Maurice Duplay on the Rue Saint-Honoré. He ate boiled chicken bread and cheese. He drank lemonade. He kept no mistresses accepted, no bribes accumulated, no property. At a time when many revolutionary leaders were helping themselves generously to whatever the new order offered, Robespierre lived like a monk. A contemporary once wryly remarked that Robespierre was the kind of man who would pay someone to offer him a bribe just so he could make a show of declining it. So what happened? This is the question that has genuinely occupied serious historians for 2 centuries, and I'm not going to pretend there is a clean answer, but I want to offer you the version that I think is closest to true. Robespierre did not become monstrous because he became corrupt or power-hungry in the conventional sense. He became monstrous because he was perfect, or rather because he believed he was perfect, and because in a time of genuine crisis, that belief became the most dangerous thing imaginable. The revolution between 1791 and 1793 was in trouble. Real trouble. Not just internally, though the factional fighting within the revolutionary government was ferocious, with different groups tearing at each other constantly, but from outside. Austria and Prussia had declared war on France. Counter-revolutionary armies were fighting in the Vendée region in western France with terrible violence. The king had been executed in January of 1793. The Republic was surrounded by enemies on every side, and the men running it were under enormous pressure that would have cracked almost anyone. Robespierre processed that pressure through the framework of virtue and betrayal. His reading of Rousseau had given him an answer to every political problem. The people were fundamentally good, and therefore any problem could be traced to corrupt individuals who had infiltrated the people's cause. The revolution was failing not because the ideals were wrong, not because the circumstances were impossible, not because governing a country in the middle of a war while simultaneously dismantling an entire social order is extremely difficult, no. The revolution was failing because enemies within were sabotaging it, and so the solution was to identify the enemies and remove them. By the summer of 1793, Robespierre was the dominant force on the Committee of Public Safety, the 12-man body that exercised near-dictatorial control over France. And from that position, over the following year, he oversaw something that no one who knew the young lawyer from Arras, who could not bear to sentence a murderer to death, could have anticipated: the Reign of Terror. We will spend significant time on what that actually was and how it operated. But for now, what I want to focus on is a single speech, because it may be the most revealing thing Robespierre ever said, and it explains everything about how a good person can arrive at terrible places. In February of 1794, Robespierre stood before the National Convention and delivered what is now known as the Speech on the Principles of Political Morality. He was by this point arguably the most powerful man in France, and he said something that sends a chill down my spine every time I read it. He said, if the spring of popular government in time of peace is virtue, then the spring of popular government in time of revolution is virtue combined with terror. Virtue without terror is powerless. Terror without virtue is destructive. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. Read that again slowly. He was not pretending. He genuinely believed it. He had constructed a logic that was in its own sealed way, internally consistent if the Republic was virtuous, and if terror was the instrument that defended the Republic, then terror was virtuous. Any suffering caused by terror was not his fault, it was the fault of the enemies who had made terror necessary. This is what happens when ideology becomes unquestionable, when a person becomes so identified with a cause that any doubt about the cause becomes personally unacceptable. Robespierre had spent his entire adult life building an identity around the revolution, and the revolution and himself had become somewhere along the way the same thing. He was not the revolution's servant. He was its embodiment, its conscience, its pure and incorruptible guardian. And anyone who might prove him wrong, anyone who questioned, who pushed back, who suggested that perhaps things had gone too far, was not a critic. They were a traitor. Here is the detail that I think about most, and I will offer it without much commentary because I think it speaks for itself. Maurice Duplay, the carpenter in whose home Robespierre lived for years, had 4 daughters. The oldest, a young woman named Eleanore, fell in love with Robespierre. By most accounts, he was aware of her feelings. By most accounts, the feeling was mutual in some fashion. She kept a small portrait medallion of him that she wore against her chest reportedly until the day she died. They never married. Robespierre always had one more thing to attend to, one more speech to prepare, one more enemy of the Republic to identify. The Republic of Virtue, it turned out, did not leave much room for an actual private life. There is something in that image Eleanore Duplay wearing his portrait while he systematically sent men to their deaths in the name of an ideal that contains the whole tragedy of Robespierre in miniature. He was not incapable of human connection. He was not purely cold. He was a man who had chosen an abstraction over everything real and had convinced himself that this was the highest possible form of love. I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Have you ever believed so strongly in something, a political idea, a cause, a vision of how the world should be, that you became unwilling to hear criticism of it? Where doubt started to feel like betrayal, most of us have been there in some small way. It is a very human place to find yourself. The difference between that feeling and what happened to Robespierre is not the feeling itself. It is the scale. It is the power. It is what happens when a person who has merged their identity entirely with an ideology also happens to have access to the machinery of a state. Because at the height of his power, Robespierre made a statement that was breathtaking in its clarity and its horror. He declared that any person who trembled when the revolution acted was presumed guilty. Think about that. Not acting against the revolution, not speaking against it, trembling. The involuntary physical response of a frightened person was enough to mark them as an enemy. Fear itself became evidence of guilt, and in a country where 17,000 people would be officially executed in less than a year, where 300,000 would be arrested, where tens of thousands would die in prison, or in the provinces without any formal sentence at all, the fear was everywhere. Which meant under Robespierre's logic the guilt was everywhere. Here is what I find most unbearable about this story and why I keep returning to it. Robespierre was not stupid. He was not unintelligent or unaware. He read history. He knew what had happened to other revolutions, other republics, other attempts to build something new in the ruins of something old. He had studied the Romans obsessively for a reason, because he knew that republics could fail, that virtue could curdle, that the men who built great things were often consumed by them in the end. He knew all of this, and he believed with complete sincerity that he was different, that he was pure enough, virtuous enough, incorruptible enough, that the pattern which had destroyed every other idealist in history would not destroy him. He was wrong. And the way he discovered he was wrong, the way the revolution finally dealt with the man who had made himself its embodiment, is one of the most extraordinary reversals in modern political history. That story is coming very soon, but first we need to understand the machine he built to protect the revolution, a machine that did not care whose neck it eventually found. And that machine had a name that still, after all this time, still carries a strange weight when you say it out loud. The guillotine. There is a number I want you to hold in your mind. 150. That is the number of active killers who participated in the September massacres of 1792. 150 people in a city of over 600,000 were responsible for the murder of between 1,100 and 1,400 prisoners over 5 consecutive days. The rest of Paris, some watched, some stayed behind closed shutters, some looked the other way and told themselves they did not know what was happening. 150 people and approximately 1,400 dead. That ratio, the gap between the number who did the killing and the number of people who chose not to stop it, is the thing about the September massacres that never quite leaves me. Because it does not describe monsters, not really. It describes something more uncomfortable than monsters. It describes what ordinary human beings are capable of when 3 specific conditions align: genuine fear, collective permission, and the absence of consequence. Let me take you back to September of 1792, not to the prisons not yet, but to the mood of the city. France had been at war since April, and the war was not going well. In late July, the Duke of Brunswick, commanding a combined Prussian and Austrian force, issued what became known as the Brunswick Manifesto. He threatened with precise and chilling specificity to burn Paris to the ground and execute every revolutionary leader if the French royal family was harmed. That manifesto was intended to intimidate. It did the opposite. It told Paris in plain language that foreign armies were coming, that those armies intended to reverse everything the revolution had built, and that somewhere in this city, in its prisons, in its neighbourhoods, in its churches and courtyards, there were people waiting to help those armies when they arrived. This is called a prison plot conspiracy theory, and in 1792, Paris, it was everywhere. The fear that the prisons were full of royalists, refractory priests and enemy agents who would break out and open the gates the moment Prussian troops reached the city walls. This fear was not manufactured from nothing. It was a real fear held by real people living through a real invasion. On August 29th, Prussian forces took the fortress of Verdun. Verdun, the great defensive fortress of northeastern France, just a few days' march from Paris. The city had been stripped of many of its able-bodied men who had gone to the front. Left behind were women, the elderly, children, and in the minds of a terrified population, prison cells full of enemies. On September 1st, the journalist Jean-Paul Marat posted public notices calling on Parisians to take justice into their own hands before leaving for the front. His call was direct. His language was violent. He was by that point the most popular radical voice in the city. The following day, September 2nd, 1792, it began. A group of 24 priests was being transferred by cart to the Abbé prison on the left bank. They were non-juring clergy priests who had refused to swear loyalty to the revolutionary government's reorganization of the Catholic Church. Whether they were genuinely counter-revolutionary is debatable. What is not debatable is what happened when the cart was stopped. A crowd gathered. The mob pulled the priest from the cart. Within minutes, all 24 were dead. What followed over the next 5 days does not have a comfortable way of being described. Gangs moved through the city to the Abbé, to the Conciergerie, to the Carme convent, to the Bicêtre hospital prison, to La Force, to La Salpêtrière, and at each location they established what they called tribunals, makeshift courts, men sitting at tables examining prisoners brought before them, asking questions, rendering verdicts. The verdicts were almost always the same: guilty. Next, 19 prisoners were acquitted at the Abbé and allowed to leave through a gauntlet of the crowd. The accounts of those 19 describe something surreal. People who had been certain they were about to die walking out through a crowd that simply parted for them, cheering as they passed. A tiny arbitrary handful allowed to live, apparently to demonstrate that the process had some semblance of justice. The rest did not walk out. Before I go further, I want to pause and sit with the actual human beings caught inside this. At the Bicêtre, one of Paris's largest hospital prisons, 162 people were killed. 43 of them were under the age of 18. The youngest was 12 years old. 12 years old, in a prison, during a revolution that claimed to be about the rights of man. At La Salpêtrière, the women's prison, 40 women were killed. Many were prostitutes imprisoned for what we would now recognize as poverty crimes. They had nothing to do with any counter-revolutionary plot. They were simply there. The most famous victim is perhaps the Princess de Lamballe, a woman who had been Marie Antoinette's closest friend for years, who had voluntarily returned from the safety of exile in England because she could not bear to leave the Queen. She was brought before the tribunal at La Force prison and asked to swear an oath denouncing the monarchy and the royal family. She refused. The tribunal declared her fate. She was killed in the courtyard of the prison, and her head. I am telling you this because it happened, and because looking away from it would be its own kind of dishonesty, was mounted on a pike and paraded through the streets to the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette and the royal family were being held captive. The guards who escorted it reportedly shouted up at the Queen's window. Marie Antoinette, by some accounts, fainted when she saw what was outside. By the mercy of whatever passed for mercy in those 5 days, she did not see it directly. But she was told. She knew. Now let me tell you about the government's response, because this is the part that reveals with terrible clarity how far the revolution had travelled from its original promises. The Minister of the Interior, a moderate revolutionary named Jean-Marie Roland, wrote a letter that day to the National Assembly that contained one of the most extraordinary sentences I have ever encountered in the documents of the French Revolution. He wrote, "Yesterday was a day that we should perhaps throw a veil on." That was the official response. Draw a veil on it. Look away. Move on. Georges Danton, the Minister of Justice, a big, booming, physically imposing man who was often celebrated as the revolution's most passionate voice, was approached by colleagues asking him to intervene, to send forces to stop what was happening in the prisons. His response, reported by multiple sources, was this: "To hell with the prisoners. They must look after themselves." Jean-Paul Marat, who had helped light the match, celebrated the massacres in print as a justified purification of the revolution. Not a single leading member of the revolutionary government was prosecuted. Not one was removed from office. Not one faced any formal consequence for what happened or did not happen during those 5 days, because the government needed the people who had done this. They were the revolution's base, its engine, the crowds that showed up and made things happen. And you do not alienate the people who show up and make things happen, even when what they have made happen is something you cannot bring yourself to name in print. Here is what I think about when I think about the September massacres, and I offer this as my personal reading rather than settled history. I think September 1792 was the moment the revolution decided, not consciously, not in a single meeting or declaration, but in the slow accumulating way that moral choices are actually made, that collective security was worth more than individual innocence. That if the enemy might be among us, and if the enemy's victory would destroy everything, then it was acceptable to err on the side of preemptive destruction. This is not unique to the French Revolution. This logic appears in history with a regularity that is genuinely frightening. The idea that a threatened community can suspend the normal rules about guilt and innocence, about evidence and proportion, when it believes its existence is at stake. The 20th century is full of examples so large and so well documented that they have their own names. What makes the September massacres distinctive is not their scale. They were not the largest atrocity of the revolutionary period by a significant margin. What makes them distinctive is their timing. They happened 3 years into a revolution that had begun with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. 3 years after France had proclaimed to the world and to itself that every human being possessed natural rights that no authority could take away. And then 150 people took those rights away from more than 1,000 people over 5 days, and the government that had proclaimed those rights wrote it a letter saying perhaps we should draw a veil on it. The distance between the proclamation and the practice that is the September massacres in one sentence. What happened to the specific people who committed these killings? Almost nothing. A few were prosecuted in subsequent years, but the cases mostly petered out. The government found it difficult to prosecute individuals for participating in what had been at the time implicitly encouraged by officials and cheered in certain newspapers. The historical record of who specifically did what is in most cases permanently obscure, but we know the number, 150 active participants, which means that in a city of 600,000 people, the overwhelming majority of Parisians, people who had stormed the Bastille, marched to Versailles, who'd been present at every stage of this revolution, chose not to participate, chose consciously or not to join. That is worth remembering, I think. Not to minimize what happened, not to soften it, but because the story of the September massacres is too often told as though the whole of Paris had gone mad, and that is not quite right either. The whole of Paris was afraid. The whole of Paris was watching. But only 150 people lifted their hands. The rest of them, 600,000 people who stayed behind their shutters or stood at the edges of crowds, made a different choice. Not a heroic choice, not a choice that saved anyone, but a different one. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about collective violence. It is almost never as universal as it appears from the outside, and it is almost never as rare as we would like to believe from the inside. The September massacres haunted the rest of the revolution like a ghost in a corridor. Moderate revolutionaries who had been in Paris that week, men and women who had believed in the ideals, who had signed documents and given speeches about liberty and the dignity of every person, knew what had happened. They had seen it, or they had heard it, or they had smelled it in the air of the city for days afterward, and many of them in the months that followed began to pull back, to hedge, to speak more carefully, to choose their associations more deliberately. It did not save them, because the machine was already running, and once a machine designed to identify and eliminate enemies achieves momentum, the definition of enemy tends to expand. Within a year, the same revolutionary government that had quietly tolerated the September massacres would be conducting mass executions under formal legal authority through official courts with proper paperwork and procedures. The guillotine would be busy, the tribunals would be sitting around the clock, and the question of who was an enemy and who was a citizen would be decided not by courts of law, but by the revolutionary conscience of a committee of 12 men meeting in a room in Paris. The Reign of Terror had its roots in September 1792. Not in any grand political decision, not in any single speech or decree. It grew from that week of shuttered windows and drawn veils, and 5 days when a city decided collectively and by silence that it could live with what was happening in its prisons. It is a lesson that every era has had to learn, and that every era manages to be surprised by, and there is one more figure standing in the shadow of all of this who we have not properly met yet, a woman, whose death in a copper bathtub in a rented room became one of the revolution's most enduring images. A woman whose act of violence was, depending on whom you ask, either the most futile gesture or the most clarifying one of the entire decade. Her name was Charlotte Corday. She had read everything. She had believed in the revolution completely, and she had watched what the revolution had become, what she decided to do about it, and what it tells us about the strange human, irreducible desire to do something, anything, when the world has gone wrong. That is a story worth telling. But first we need to understand the machine that Charlotte Corday was responding to. The one that Robespierre built and operated and ultimately could not escape. The guillotine itself, its origins, its logic, its strange journey, from humanitarian invention to symbol of everything the revolution became. That story is next, Of all the stories the French Revolution produced, this might be the one I find most genuinely strange, not the violence itself, but the idea behind the instrument of it. Because the guillotine was not invented by a tyrant. It was not the brainchild of someone who wanted to terrorize a population or demonstrate the power of the state over the individual. It was invented by a doctor, a humanitarian, a man who spent his career arguing against the death penalty and lost, and then in losing decided that if executions had to happen, at least they could happen decently. The story of the guillotine is at its core a story about good intentions, about how the most sincere desire to reduce suffering can, under the right circumstances, produce exactly the opposite of what was intended. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part, not the blade, the intentions behind it. Joseph Ignace Guillotin was born in 1738 in a town called Saintes in southwestern France. There is a story, probably apocryphal, but so perfectly shaped that it deserves to be mentioned, that his mother went into premature labour after hearing the screams of a man being broken on the wheel nearby. Whether or not that is true, Guillotin grew up with an acute sensitivity to physical suffering that would define everything he did professionally and politically. He was, by the time the revolution arrived in 1789, a physician, a professor of anatomy, and a newly elected member of the National Assembly. He had been present at the tennis court oath. He had participated in the early idealistic phase of the revolution with genuine conviction, and in October of that same year he rose before the Assembly and made a proposal that was met with, depending on the account, either laughter or awkward silence. He proposed a machine, a beheading machine, one that would ensure that all condemned persons, regardless of class or wealth, would die in exactly the same way, swiftly, mechanically, with a minimum of suffering. What motivated this proposal was something genuinely progressive. Before the revolution, the method of your execution depended on who you were. Nobles were beheaded by sword, which was considered merciful and dignified. Commoners were hanged, burned broken on the wheel, or subjected to any number of other methods that were neither dignified nor quick. The same crime, different death, depending entirely on the accident of birth. This was the old order in miniature, the aristocracy getting one standard of treatment, everyone else getting another. Guillotin wanted to end that. He wanted death to be equal. The Assembly listened. There was reportedly some laughter at his description of the machine, he said, with perhaps more enthusiasm than the moment called for that. With his device the head would fly off, the blood would spurt, and the man would no longer exist. Someone in the gallery giggled. The newspapers the next day mocked him gently, but the idea was considered and eventually accepted. The actual design of the machine was not Guillotin's work. He proposed the concept, but the engineering was done by a French surgeon named Antoine Louis, and the physical construction was carried out by a German harpsichord maker named Tobias Schmidt. This detail, a harpsichord maker building a guillotine, sits somewhere between poetic irony and pure historical coincidence, and I have never quite decided which. There is one more delightful twist in the guillotine's origin story. According to the memoirs of the royal executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, King Louis XVI himself, amateur locksmith tinkerer man of mechanical interests, reviewed the prototype drawings and suggested a modification. The original design called for a curved blade. The king apparently pointed out that a curved blade might not work equally well on necks of different sizes, and recommended an angled diagonal blade instead. Louis XVI, in other words, helped design the machine that would behead him. I have thought about that fact more times than is probably healthy. The first official test was conducted in April of 1792 at the Bicêtre Hospital, where the device painted blood red, as was the tradition for execution equipment, was tested on animal carcasses and then on the corpses of executed prisoners before being declared satisfactory. The first living person to be executed was a highwayman named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier on the 25th of April 1792. The crowd that assembled to watch was reportedly disappointed. The whole thing was over so quickly. People who had come expecting something dramatic, something that looked like justice being done with all the theatre that public executions had traditionally provided, found themselves watching a lever being pulled, and a blade falling, and a body going limp in less time than it takes to draw a full breath. Someone in the crowd reportedly shouted, "Give us back our wooden gibbet." The guillotine was too fast, too clean, too anticlimactic for a crowd that had been raised on public executions as entertainment. But it was efficient, extraordinarily, almost frighteningly efficient. The executioner Sanson reportedly demonstrated that he could guillotine a dozen people in 13 minutes. 12 human beings, 13 minutes. The arithmetic of that, once you actually do it, is something that never quite leaves you. At the height of the Reign of Terror in June of 1794, barely 2 years after that first test on animals at Bastille, 40 executions were carried out in a single day in Paris alone. Here is the question that I think sits at the centre of the guillotine story, and I want you to really sit with it. Would the Reign of Terror have been possible without the guillotine? Not in the moral sense, whether it was right or wrong. I mean practically, mechanically. Could 17,000 official executions have been carried out in less than a year if the means of execution had been slower, more labour-intensive, more personally demanding of the people carrying them out? When you have to look someone in the eye and do something to them with your own hands, there are natural limits. Not reliable moral limits. History has shown those can be overridden under enough pressure. But physical ones, practical ones, a process that requires genuine effort, genuine presence, genuine attention to each individual moment. The guillotine removed those limits. It industrialized the act. It transformed something that had always been at some level an act of one person upon another into a mechanical process. Pull the lever. Next. Pull the lever. Next. This is not an argument that technology causes violence. It is an argument that the form violence takes its speed, its scale, its psychological cost to the people carrying it out, is shaped by the tools available for it. And when you make something easier, you make more of it possible. Guillotin understood this eventually. By the time the Reign of Terror was underway, he was watching his name attached to thousands of deaths, watching the instrument he had conceived as a mercy become an emblem of something he had never imagined. He tried to distance himself from the device. He lobbied to have it renamed. He failed. When he died in 1814 of natural causes peacefully in Paris, which is more than can be said for the vast majority of his revolutionary contemporaries, his family was so appalled by the association that they petitioned the French government to rename the guillotine. When the government declined, they renamed themselves. The Guillotin family, somewhere in the early 19th century, became the Guillotin family no longer. They changed their name entirely. Their ancestor had wanted to prevent suffering. His name had become a synonym for mass death, and the only escape they could find was to stop being named after him. The social world around the guillotine, the culture that grew up alongside it, is one of the more fascinating and disquieting chapters of this period, and it is one that tends to get left out of the standard accounts. The place of execution was the Place de la Révolution, the same broad square that today is called the Place de la Concorde, where tourists photograph fountains and obelisks. In 1793 and 1794 it was where France went to watch. And France did go to watch. Vendors set up stalls in the square selling pamphlets listing the day's condemned food, wine and souvenirs. Miniature guillotines, fully functional scale models were sold as toys. There are records of children using them to behead dolls and small animals. Vendors sold swatches of cloth that had, they claimed, been dipped in the blood of famous victims. After the execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793, People pushed forward to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. Others auctioned his hat from the scaffold. His hair ribbons were sold by the executioner's assistant. There were women who attended the executions every day, knitting in the front rows, barely looking up when the blade fell, counting heads, the way a seamstress counts stitches. These women, the tricoteuses they were called, have become one of the most iconic images of the Terror. The image of it, women with their needles and yarn, the rhythmic click of knitting needles punctuating the fall of the blade. Charles Dickens, writing more than 60 years later in a novel set during these events, described them sitting in their chairs at the Place de la Révolution as if in a garden of public diversion. I cannot improve on that phrase. A garden of public diversion. And the restaurants nearby, several of them were reportedly quite popular precisely because the Place de la Révolution was a reliable source of foot traffic. You could have dinner, watch an execution, order dessert. I want to be careful not to judge people across 2 centuries of distance for behaviour that I think is more comprehensible than it is monstrous. Human beings normalize extraordinary things when those things happen daily. When execution becomes routine, routine becomes normalized. The capacity to sit and knit while watching a blade fall is not, I think, evidence that those women were particularly cold-blooded. It is evidence that they had been watching it every day for months. Normalization is a very human survival mechanism, and it is also one of the most frightening things about human beings. There is a detail about the guillotine that generated considerable scientific debate in its own time, a detail that is, depending on your constitution, either fascinating or genuinely disturbing. Possibly both. The question of whether the severed head remained conscious for any period after decapitation, this was not idle speculation. Doctors of the period argued about it in formal publications. The revolutionary period produced at least one documented case, that of a condemned man named Henri Languille, later in this same era, where a physician observed and recorded what he believed to be signs of consciousness in the severed head after execution. The condemned man had agreed in advance to try to communicate. The doctor called his name. Languille's eyes reportedly opened and focused. Whether any of this is medically credible is a matter that neurologists still debate. The point for our purposes is not the science, it is the cultural moment. A society so enmeshed in the daily reality of mass mechanical execution that its physicians were publishing papers on whether the experience of dying by guillotine was exactly as instantaneous as advertised. There is also a story never confirmed but persistent about Charlotte Corday, the woman who would kill Jean-Paul Marat in his bath and be executed for it. The story goes that after her head was held up to the crowd by the executioner's assistant, he slapped her cheek apparently as a theatrical gesture, and witnesses reported that her face showed an expression of indignation. Whether that story is true matters less, I think, than the fact that it was told and retold and continued to be told, because it captures something real about the cultural anxiety of the period, the sense that even the guillotine's definitive finality was somehow not final enough that the dead might still have something to say about what had been done to them. By the end of the Reign of Terror, the guillotine had consumed not just its intended targets, but the people who had championed it most loudly. Georges Danton, who had helped create the revolutionary tribunal that sent thousands to the blade past Robespierre's house on his way to the scaffold. The story, and I cannot verify it, but it is too good, too perfectly shaped not to include, is that he shouted, "You will soon follow me." He was right. Within 3 months, Robespierre himself went to the guillotine. The man who had called terror an emanation of virtue, who had built the system that made mass judicial execution a function of the state, ended his life under the blade of the machine that system had made ubiquitous. The executioner's name was the same Sanson, the same family that had executed Louis XVI, the same blade, the same square. France after the Terror would continue to use the guillotine for nearly 2 centuries. The last execution by guillotine in France took place on the 10th of September 1977 in modern memory, within the lifetime of people alive today. France abolished the death penalty in 1981. What Joseph Ignace Guillotin wanted ultimately was the abolition of capital punishment altogether. The machine was supposed to be a step toward that, a way of making death so quick and so equal that eventually society would realize it could dispense with death altogether as a tool of governance. It took 190 years to get there, and in the meantime his name will be associated forever not with the abolition of suffering but with its most efficient delivery. I keep coming back to Guillotin himself standing somewhere in Paris in the winter of 1793 and 1794, watching what his idea had become. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for people whose good intentions are turned into instruments of the very thing they were trying to prevent. It is not the grief of villains who at least knew what they were doing. It is the grief of optimists who misjudged the world they were trying to improve. The guillotine is in many ways the perfect symbol for the French Revolution as a whole. Born of genuine idealism, designed with care, built by a craftsman, approved democratically, and then used in ways that no one who designed it or approved it had anticipated on a scale that none of them could have imagined until it consumed even the people who built the system that used it. There is a woman who saw all of this clearly, who looked at the revolution that had begun with such promise, and what it had become, the September massacres, the Revolutionary Tribunal, the daily fall of the blade in the Place de la Révolution, and decided with extraordinary and terrible logic that she knew exactly who was responsible. She was 24 years old. She'd grown up in Normandy reading the Enlightenment philosophers. She had travelled to Paris alone, and she had a kitchen knife and an appointment she had made under a false name. Her name was Charlotte Corday. And what happened in a bathtub in the Rue des Cordeliers on the 13th of July 1793 is a story about the limits of patience, the seduction of certainty, and the particular kind of courage or madness, depending on your reading, that comes from believing that one action can change the course of history. That story and what it reveals about the revolution's soul in that moment is exactly where we are going next. In 1770, a 14-year-old girl was stripped of everything she owned, not metaphorically, literally. At a point on the border between Austria and France, a small island in the Rhine River called the Île aux Épis, she was escorted into a specially constructed pavilion and required to remove every single item of clothing and possession she had brought from Vienna. Every dress, every piece of jewellery, every personal effect, everything that connected her to the country where she'd been born and raised was taken away and replaced with French items. French clothes, French jewellery, French ladies-in-waiting. Even her lapdog, a small fluffy creature she had apparently been quite attached to, was not permitted to accompany her into France. She would spend the next 23 years of her life never truly belonging to either country. Her name was Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. France would call her Marie Antoinette. I want to spend some time here because I think Marie Antoinette is one of the most persistently misunderstood figures of the French Revolution, and I say that as someone who believes the misunderstanding runs in both directions. There are people who despise her as the embodiment of royal excess and indifference to suffering, and there are people who have fully rehabilitated her as an innocent victim of misogyny and political scapegoating. I think both of those readings miss something more interesting. The story of a specific flawed, occasionally foolish, genuinely human woman who was assigned a symbolic role that no actual person could have survived intact. She was the 15th child, the 15th of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, which meant that by the time Marie Antoinette arrived, her mother had largely run out of personal attention to give. She was educated enough to be charming, not enough to be deep. Her tutors reported not unkindly that she was resistant to sustained effort and had a lively mind that preferred amusement to scholarship, which describes honestly most 14-year-olds, though very few of them are then sent across a border to marry the future King of France and represent the entire geopolitical relationship between two empires. Her husband, the future Louis XVI, was 15 when they married. He was shy, bookish, and almost pathologically uncomfortable with the ceremonial demands of court life. Their marriage was not consummated for 7 years, a fact that was very much public knowledge at Versailles, whispered about, endlessly used against Marie Antoinette, in ways that range from merely unkind to genuinely cruel. The reasons for this are still debated by historians, but the effect on a young woman already far from home, already lonely, already trying to navigate one of the most treacherous social environments in Europe was predictably damaging. She wrote letters to her mother in Vienna, long candid letters full of things she could not say to anyone in France. She described the exhausting surveillance of court life, the way she could not take a bath, dress, eat or walk without being observed and evaluated. She described the loneliness of a marriage that was for years more performance than partnership. She wrote about missing Austria in a way that would have gotten her in political trouble had anyone read the letters too closely, and she sought escape. This is the part that the revolution and history frankly was least forgiving about. Marie Antoinette's response to a life of relentless surveillance, social pressure and emotional isolation was to build herself a private world. The Petit Trianon, a small palace on the grounds of Versailles that Louis XVI gave her as a personal retreat, became the physical expression of this. She redesigned it according to her own taste. She created a garden that was deliberately intimate rather than grand. She had a small village constructed on the grounds, a working farm essentially with cottages and a mill and actual livestock, where she could play at a simpler, more private life. The hameau this little hamlet cost more than 2 million livres to construct. I will just let that sit there for a moment. In a country where ordinary people were spending the majority of their income on bread, the Queen built herself a fantasy farm where she could pretend to be a shepherdess. She did not actually herd sheep, that part of the legend is false, but the gulf between the image and the reality of French life was the kind of thing that once people learned about it became impossible to forgive, and the pamphlets came. This is something that I think requires its own moment of attention, because it shaped everything that happened to Marie Antoinette in ways that went far beyond anything she actually did. Starting in the 1770s and escalating through the 1780s, a flood of printed material circulated in Paris, depicting the Queen in terms that were explicitly pornographic, wildly fabricated, and deliberately designed to destroy her reputation, and through it the legitimacy of the monarchy. She was accused of every variety of sexual transgression. Pamphlets described imaginary orgies. Fictional memoirs detailed invented affairs with women with members of the court, with her own brother-in-law. The diamond necklace affair of 1785, a financial scandal in which Marie Antoinette was completely innocent, but which the public was entirely willing to believe she had orchestrated, attached the nickname Madame Deficit to her. The suggestion that her personal spending was responsible for the financial ruin of France. She was not responsible for the financial ruin of France. That had considerably more to do with 2 decades of expensive wars and a tax system that systematically exempted the people most capable of paying. But she was visible, she was foreign, she was female, and she had in the early years of her reign genuinely spent more than she should have on clothes and gambling and the social entertainment she used to fill the emotional void in her life. The truth was somewhere between the propaganda and the rehabilitation. She was neither the monster the pamphlets described nor the wholly innocent victim some later accounts suggested. She was a woman who'd been placed in an impossible position, and who had not, it must be said, always handled it with the wisdom the moment required. But the punishment that came was not proportional to the error. The revolution took everything from her in stages the way a tide takes a beach slowly and then all at once. First the politics, then the palace, then the freedom, then the husband, then the children. On the 3rd of July, 1793, 8 months after Louis XVI had been executed, 8-year-old Louis Charles, the young Dauphin who royalists abroad were calling Louis XVII, was taken from his mother by force. Marie Antoinette fought to keep him. Physically fought, holding her son, refusing to release him while prison guards waited in the room for her to comply. The struggle lasted, depending on the account, somewhere between an hour and several hours. Eventually exhausted and outnumbered, she let go. She could hear him crying in the cell below hers. For weeks, according to those who were present, she would press herself against the floor, listening for any sound that told her he was still alive. He was alive. He was being systematically, psychologically broken by his keepers, who were forcing him to denounce his mother and make accusations against her that would later be used in her trial. The child apparently did not fully understand what he was saying. He was 8 years old. The trial began on the 14th of October, 1793. It lasted 2 days, which was roughly 48 hours more than it needed to, since the verdict had been determined before the first witness took the stand. The charges against her were extensive and largely fabricated. She was accused of depleting the national treasury, a charge that contained a grain of truth stretched across a vast field of exaggeration. She was accused of conspiracy against the state, more credible, given her documented correspondence with foreign courts. And then there was the third charge introduced midway through the trial by a man named Jacques Hébert, which I will not describe in detail, because it is genuinely obscene, an accusation of sexual abuse directed at her own 8-year-old son. When the charge was read aloud and the president of the tribunal asked her to respond, Marie Antoinette was silent for a long moment. Then she said, and I am quoting here as faithfully as the historical record allows, "If I have not replied, it is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother." She then turned to the gallery and made a direct appeal to every mother in the room. Some of those women called out for the proceedings to stop. The trial continued anyway. She was found guilty. She'd expected at worst life imprisonment. The sentence was death. On the night of the 15th of October, in a small damp cell at the Conciergerie, the prison that sat on the banks of the Seine and was known with dark accuracy as the antechamber of death, Marie Antoinette wrote a letter. She wrote it to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, who had stayed in France out of loyalty to the royal family when she could have fled to safety abroad. The letter is addressed to someone who would never receive it. The guards kept it. It was eventually found among the personal papers of Robespierre under his mattress, which is a detail that contains more psychological complexity than I know how to unpack in this context. The letter is not the letter of a monster. It is the letter of a woman who knows she's going to die in a few hours and is trying to hold herself together long enough to say goodbye to the people she loves. She writes about her children. She asks Elizabeth to care for them. She says that leaving them forever is the most heartbreaking thing, the hardest part of what was about to happen to her. She's steady on the page, and you can tell how much effort that steadiness costs. She ends the letter, "Adieu, my good and affectionate sister. I trust that this letter will reach you. Continue to think of me. I send you my most heartfelt love, and also to my poor dear children. How heartbreaking it is to leave them forever." The letter did not reach Elizabeth. Elizabeth herself was executed 8 months later in May of 1794. The morning of the 16th of October, 1793. Before dawn, the guards came and took her to change clothes. She'd wanted to wear black, the traditional colour of mourning for widowed queens of France. She was told no. She was given a plain white dress and a white cap. Her hair, once famously elaborate, once the subject of envy and satire and paintings, was cut very short. Her hands were tied behind her back. She was put on a rope leash. The difference between the humiliation visited on Louis XVI 9 months earlier and what was done to his wife is worth noting. Louis had been transported in a carriage. Marie Antoinette was placed in an open wooden cart a tumbrel, so that the crowds lining the streets of Paris could see her clearly as it moved. The journey was deliberately slow, deliberately public. A man on the route, a painter named Jacques-Louis David, who was present and who made a quick, harsh sketch, captured her on the cart. In the sketch, she is thin and upright, white-haired, old-looking in a way that 37 years should not have made her. She's looking straight ahead. Whatever she is feeling, she is not showing it. At the scaffold, a priest told her to have courage. She said, "Courage. The moment when my ills are going to end is not the moment when courage is going to fail me." She stepped onto the scaffold and accidentally trod on the foot of the executioner, Henri Sanson. Her last recorded words were an apology to him. "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." At 12:15 in the afternoon of the 16th of October, 1793, 2 weeks before her 38th birthday, she was dead. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave in a cemetery that was filled to capacity the following year and closed. It was not until 1793 was 4 months old that they identified and properly buried her. What do I make of Marie Antoinette when I sit down and try to think about her honestly? I think she was a person who was never given the tools for the life she was assigned. She was sent from home at 14. She was turned into a symbol before she understood what symbols were. She was hated for what she represented before she had done enough to actually deserve it. And then when she had done things that genuinely contributed to the crisis, the punishment far exceeded what justice could have required. The most damaging thing she ever actually did was probably her obstinate opposition to the reform ministers. Her role in getting Turgot and Necker dismissed her influence on Louis XVI in the direction of resistance to change rather than adaptation. This was real. This had consequences. The Queen, who opposed tax reform in a country that was going bankrupt, partly because the powerful refused to be taxed, was not an innocent bystander to the revolution. She was a participant in the conditions that created it, but the trial that ended her life charged her with things that had no relation to any of that. It charged her with crimes that required her son to testify against her. It charged her with a sexual offence she was wholly innocent of. It charged her with being a symbol. And ultimately that is what she was tried for. Not what she had done, what she represented. The revolution needed to kill the idea of queenship, and Marie Antoinette was the idea of queenship made flesh. Her death was not justice, it was theatre. But even as the blade fell on the Queen's neck in the Place de la Révolution, the revolution itself was beginning to show fractures that would prove fatal. The machine that had consumed Marie Antoinette was already turning toward people who'd helped build it. Allies becoming enemies. Yesterday's revolutionary becoming today's counter-revolutionary. And the man at the centre of all of it, the architect of the system that had made trials like Marie Antoinette's possible, was about to face his own impossible reckoning. The reign of terror was not yet over, and its full dimensions, the scale of it, the logic of it, the extraordinary human cost of a government that made fear, its official policy is something we need to look at squarely, without flinching before this story can move toward its end. On the 8th of May, 1794, the greatest chemist in the world asked for a 2-week delay before he was executed. He was in the middle of an experiment, he explained, an important one concerning the role of oxygen in human respiration. He had been conducting it for months carefully with the precision that had defined his entire career. The results would be meaningful. The science would matter. He just needed 2 more weeks. The Revolutionary Tribunal's response became one of the most chilling sentences of the entire period. The Republic has no need of scientists. Antoine Lavoisier, the man who had named oxygen, overturned 2,000 years of alchemical thinking about combustion, helped establish the metric system, disproved the phlogiston theory, and written the foundational textbook of modern chemistry, was guillotined that same afternoon. He was 50 years old. The mathematician Joseph Louis Lagrange, upon hearing the news, said, "It took them only a moment to cut off that head, and 100 years might not suffice to produce its like again." He was right, and the revolution did it anyway. The Reign of Terror is not a story that resists simple description so much as it resists honest comprehension. The numbers are large enough to be abstract. Between September of 1793 and July of 1794, 10 months, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people were arrested in France. 17,000 were officially tried and executed. Another 10,000 died in prison without trial, from disease or mistreatment, or simply from the conditions in overcrowded cells. And beyond those official figures in the provinces and in the wars of suppression being waged against regional uprisings, tens of thousands more were killed outside any formal judicial framework. The total death toll by the most credible historical estimates sits somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people in 10 months. But here is what those numbers cannot quite capture, the thing that I find most important about the Reign of Terror, and the thing that is most relevant to understanding how ordinary societies arrive at extraordinary violence. It was legal, all of it. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it matters enormously. The revolution from its very beginning had placed enormous moral weight on the idea of law. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was a legal document. The Constitution was a legal achievement. The trials of the King and Queen were at least nominally legal proceedings. Even the most extreme acts of the revolutionary government were processed through institutions, committees, tribunals, assemblies that wore the clothing of legal authority. The Reign of Terror operated the same way. It was not a period of lawlessness. It was in a profound and disturbing sense the opposite, a period of excessive, suffocating law. On the 17th of September 1793, the National Convention passed what became known as the Law of Suspects. This was the foundation on which the terror was built, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Law of Suspects defined who could be arrested and detained as an enemy of the revolution. The categories it listed were broad to the point of near universality. A suspect was anyone who had shown themselves by their conduct to be enemies of liberty. A suspect was anyone who could not justify their means of existence. A suspect was anyone who had been refused a certificate of civic virtue. A suspect was anyone related to an emigrant who had fled France. A suspect was anyone who had spoken or written against the revolution. Think about that last one for a moment. Anyone who had spoken or written against the revolution, not committed a crime, not engaged in violence, not betrayed state secrets, simply expressed a critical opinion, and silence was not safe either. Robespierre had declared famously that anyone who trembled when the revolution acted was presumed guilty, which meant that the visible, involuntary physiological reaction to fear, the thing human bodies do automatically when they are frightened, was itself evidence of guilt. There was essentially no behaviour that could not, under the right circumstances, and in the hands of the right accusers, be interpreted as counter-revolutionary intent. The machine that processed this ocean of suspects was the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris, operating alongside surveillance committees in every commune of France. At its peak, this system was receiving denouncements and processing cases 24 hours a day. And here is where I want to ask you something directly. Who was actually being executed during the Reign of Terror? If you have a mental image of this period, you probably imagine aristocrats and priests. The rich, the privileged, the obvious targets of a revolution born from class resentment. But the historical record tells a very different story. Of the 17,000 officially executed, the breakdown by social class is genuinely surprising. Nobility accounted for roughly 8% of those killed, which is fewer than you might expect given how thoroughly the nobility has dominated the image of the terror. The clergy represented 6 or 7%. About 14% were members of the middle class. The remaining 70%, more than 2/3 of the officially executed, were members of the Third Estate. The very people the revolution had claimed to represent: peasants, artisans, workers, day labourers, ordinary French men and women who had no connection to the old order, no loyalty to the king, no political enemies of note. They were executed because they had hoarded grain, or been overheard complaining about bread prices, or been denounced by a neighbour with a grudge, or worn the wrong colour, or wept when a relative was taken to prison, or failed to demonstrate sufficient revolutionary enthusiasm on a particular Tuesday afternoon when someone was watching. The revolution had begun by fighting for the Third Estate. By 1794, it was executing the Third Estate. The geography of the terror is also something that the standard accounts tend to compress, in ways that obscure its actual scale. In Paris, the executions were highly visible and thoroughly documented: the tumbrel carts, the Place de la Révolution, the tricoteuses with their knitting. But the deadliest episodes of the terror happened outside Paris in the provinces, with a brutality that the capital's relatively formal procedures could not match. In Nantes, a representative named Jean-Baptiste Carrier devised what he called Republican marriages and Republican baptisms, methods of mass killing that involved binding prisoners together in pairs and throwing them into the Loire River to drown. The victims included priests, nuns, elderly people, and children. Some estimates place the death toll in the Nantes drownings at between 1,700 and 4,000 people over the course of the winter of 1793 and 1794, in the Vendée region of western France, where Catholic peasants had risen in revolt against the revolution. The government dispatched forces specifically tasked with suppression. These forces carried orders that some historians describe as the first modern genocide. Entire villages burned. Populations scattered, a deliberate effort to destroy not just the armed resistance, but the social and cultural fabric of an entire region. The number who died in the Vendée, including in battle from massacres and from disease and displacement caused by the campaign, is estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 people. These were not the enemies the revolution had been fighting. These were French peasants, Catholic farmers, people who had been part of the Third Estate that the revolution was supposed to liberate. The philosopher Joseph de Maistre, watching from exile, wrote a sentence about this period that I have never managed to get out of my head: every nation gets the government it deserves. I think that sentence is wrong, and I think it is worth saying why. The people of France in 1793 and 1794 did not deserve what was happening to them. The peasant executed for hoarding grain had not made the decisions that brought France to this point. The young woman whose brother-in-law had emigrated, and who therefore counted as a suspect, had not designed the system that was consuming her. The artisan overheard complaining about bread prices had no power, had never had any meaningful political power in his entire life. What they had was the misfortune of living in a country where the legitimate rage of the dispossessed had been captured by people who believed they had a right, an obligation to be the arbiters of virtue. And once that belief takes institutional form, once it has committees and courts and laws behind it, it becomes nearly impossible to stop from inside. Because to challenge it is by definition to reveal yourself as the enemy. On the 10th of June, 1794, by which time the military threats that had originally justified emergency measures had largely passed. The foreign invasion had been repelled. The domestic uprisings had been suppressed. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety pushed through the law of 22 Prairial. This was the Terror's final acceleration. The new law eliminated the requirement to investigate suspects before bringing them to trial. It removed the right to legal counsel. It stripped the National Convention of oversight authority over the revolutionary tribunals, and it reduced the verdicts available to the jury to exactly two options: acquittal or death. No prison sentences, no deportation, no middle ground. The jury could release a person or send them to the guillotine and nothing in between. The mathematician in Robespierre's mind had apparently decided that if the virtue of the Republic could not be ensured through any lesser means, then all lesser means were counterproductive. The only instrument that sufficed was the permanent elimination of impurity. In the 7 weeks between the passage of the law of 22 Prairial and the end of the Terror, 7 weeks, approximately 1,400 people were executed in Paris alone. At the height of this period, the flagstones of the Place de la Révolution became so saturated with blood that the whole square reportedly began to smell. The authorities responded by moving most executions to a different location. The vendors who operated nearby complained that it was disrupting business. The blade was moved. The vendors returned to their stalls. The executions continued. I want to take a moment here to tell you about someone the revolution killed in this period, who I think represents something specific and important about what the Terror had become by 1794. Camille Desmoulins. You might remember him from an earlier chapter of this story, the 26-year-old journalist who jumped on a table in the garden of the Palais Royal in July of 1789, pulled a leaf from a chestnut tree, and gave the speech that helped ignite the storming of the Bastille. The stammering writer who could not get his pamphlets published, and who found his voice in the worst possible conditions and changed the course of French history. By 1794, Desmoulins had watched the revolution he helped spark consume the September massacres, consume the Queen, consume his friends. And he began writing again, not in celebration this time, but in horror. He published a journal called the Vieux Cordelier, the Old Cordelier, in which he argued with a courage that turned out to be fatal that the Terror had to stop, that the Republic could not survive by eating its own people. That mercy was a revolutionary virtue, not a weakness. Robespierre was his friend, had been his schoolmate at the Collège Louis le Grand. They had known each other for more than 20 years. It made no difference. Desmoulins was arrested on the 30th of March 1794. He was tried alongside Georges Danton and several others on charges that the historical record does not support with any credibility. He was guillotined on the 5th of April 1794 at the age of 34. His wife Lucille, who had written to Robespierre pleading for Camille's life, was arrested 8 days later and executed within the week. Robespierre, who'd given the toast at their wedding, sent them both to the blade. There is a term that historians sometimes use when discussing the psychology of systems like the Reign of Terror, the logic of purity. The idea that if a society is trying to become something perfect, more equal, more just, more virtuous, then impurities must be removed, and the definition of impurity must continuously expand to account for the fact that perfection is never achieved. This logic is self-sustaining in the worst possible way. If the Republic is not yet perfect, it is because enemies of the Republic remain. Therefore more enemies must be found. And since any accusation becomes evidence of the thing accused, and since any trembling is guilt, and since any mercy for the guilty is treason against the innocent, the logic requires no external enemy to keep it running. It simply turns inward and feeds on itself, producing enemies faster than the blade can process them until the system itself finally breaks under the weight of its own paranoia. That is what happened in the summer of 1794. And the manner in which it broke the specific, almost operatic way in which the revolution finally turned on the man who had made himself its embodiment, is something that contains every element of classical tragedy. It happened on the 27th of July 1794, in the calendar of the new French Republic, which had abolished the old calendar. Along with nearly everything else, that date was the 9th of Thermidor in the year 2. And the story of the 9th of Thermidor is, I would argue, the most dramatic single day of the entire French Revolution. It is coming very soon. The morning of the 26th of July, 1794, the 8th of Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, began like any other morning in Paris during the height of the Terror, which is to say, it began with the kind of quiet tension that had become the atmosphere of the city for months, the dread that had settled into ordinary life like sediment, the careful way people chose their words, the glances exchanged across tables, the calculation constant and exhausting of what could be said and to whom and in what company. Robespierre had been absent from public life for nearly 6 weeks, a mysterious withdrawal that had only amplified the paranoia already saturating the convention. Nobody knew what he was thinking, nobody knew who was next, and nobody, not a single person sitting in the National Convention chamber, was certain that it would not be them. That morning Robespierre came back. He walked to the podium and delivered what would be his final speech. It was long. It was characteristic, full of appeals to virtue, full of dark allusions to conspirators and traitors within the Republic, full of the kind of a language that had become simultaneously his most powerful tool and his most defining limitation. He spoke of enemies, he spoke of plots, he spoke of the need for continued vigilance, and he refused to name anyone. That refusal, that single fatal decision to accuse without specifying, was the mistake that killed him. Think about what it meant to be sitting in that hall listening to that speech. You knew that somewhere in those words a name was missing. You did not know if it was yours. You did not know if the man at the podium had a list, or if you were on it, or if your name would be read out in the next session, or whether one of the colleagues sitting beside you had already told him something about you. You had watched Danton go. You had watched Desmoulins go. You had watched people you knew, people you had worked alongside, people you had sat near at dozens of sessions, be arrested and executed for accusations that sometimes made sense and sometimes did not. And now Robespierre was back speaking about conspirators, and he would not say who they were. One of the deputies present a moderate man named Pierre-Joseph Cambon, who'd been keeping his head down for months and who apparently decided that his next option was now or never, stood up. He said, "It is time to tell the whole truth. One man is paralyzing the National Convention. That man is the one who has just made a speech. It is Robespierre." That sentence was an act of extraordinary courage, or extraordinary desperation, possibly both. Cambon himself was almost certainly on Robespierre's list. He had in effect nothing left to lose. Robespierre's allies shouted Cambon down, but the crack had appeared, and the next day, the 27th of July, the 9th of Thermidor, the dam broke. The morning session of the National Convention on the 27th of July 1794 started badly for Robespierre's side and deteriorated rapidly. Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, Robespierre's closest ally, a 26-year-old who'd arrived in revolutionary politics like a force of nature, who had helped design the Terror and had become one of its most fervent champions, attempted to speak first. He had been up all night preparing remarks. He barely got through his opening sentence before deputies began shouting him down. Tallien accused him of speaking without authorization. Billaud-Varenne stood and accused Robespierre of conspiracy against the convention itself. Then the room turned. Deputies who'd been silent for months, deputies who had voted for every measure, approved every arrest, watched every execution without open protest, because the alternative was to become the next person escorted to the tumbril, suddenly found their voices simultaneously. The shouts of "Down with the tyrant" rolled through the hall. Deputies who had been Robespierre's supporters yesterday were denouncing him today. The speed of the reversal was startling even by the fluid standards of revolutionary politics. Robespierre tried to speak. He was shouted down. He tried again, heckled. A deputy in the gallery cried out, "It is the blood of Danton that chokes him." Robespierre, who had sent Danton to the guillotine 3 months earlier, apparently lost his composure at this reference. He raised his voice enough to respond, "Danton. Is it Danton you regret, cowards? Why did you not defend him?" No one in the room had a good answer to that question. Instead, they voted to arrest him. The arrest order was passed for Robespierre, his brother Augustin Saint-Just, Georges Couthon, and several others. In a detail that contains its own dark irony, the man who had told the revolution that anyone who trembled was guilty now sat in silence, while the men around him decided his fate by show of hands. Here is where the story gets strange in a way that says something specific and important about Robespierre's character, something I have turned over in my mind many times. That evening, Robespierre and his allies were taken to the Hôtel de Ville, the Paris City Hall, where the Commune, which was still nominally loyal to Robespierre, had offered them sanctuary. And in those hours his supporters urged him to act. They urged him to rally the Paris sections, to call on the National Guard to organize resistance against the Convention. This was not an unreasonable proposal. Robespierre had done exactly this kind of thing before, used popular mobilization to overcome institutional opposition. It had worked against the Girondins in June of 1793. It could conceivably work now. Robespierre refused. He would not, he said, act against the Convention. The Convention was the legitimate representative body of the French people. To mobilize against it would be to mobilize against the people themselves, and he would not do that. His principles would not permit it. The man who had ordered the deaths of thousands without trial could not bring himself to organize a political challenge to a vote that had gone against him. The revolution he had made himself the embodiment of had rendered him incapable of acting to save his own life. I find this extraordinary, not as a sign of virtue, but as the fullest possible demonstration of what ideology looks like when it has consumed its host completely. Robespierre was not a hypocrite in that moment at the Hôtel de Ville. He was perfectly consistent, and his perfect consistency was his absolute paralysis. At 2 in the morning on the 28th of July, soldiers loyal to the National Convention entered the Hôtel de Ville. The scene they found was by every account chaotic and grim. Philippe Lebas, one of Robespierre's closest associates, the man who had married the youngest daughter of the Duplay family, the carpenter whose house Robespierre had called home for 3 years, had shot himself in the head. He was dead. Georges Couthon, who was partially paralyzed and had been helping design the machinery of the Terror from a wheelchair, had somehow fallen or thrown himself down a flight of stairs in an apparent suicide attempt. He survived badly injured. Augustin Robespierre Maximilian's younger brother had jumped from a window. He survived with broken legs. And Maximilien Robespierre himself, the incorruptible, the man who had never bent, never accepted a bribe, never compromised, never retreated from a position he had taken, was found with a bullet through his jaw. Whether he shot himself or was shot by a gendarme is still disputed by historians. Both versions exist in the documents of the period, and neither is entirely conclusive. What we know is this: the wound shattered his lower jaw. Teeth were removed. A white bandage was wrapped around his face, tying his jaw in place. He was carried to the Committee of Public Safety on a plank, the man who had chaired that committee, who had run it for more than a year, and laid on a table in the same meeting room where he had signed so many death warrants. Someone present reported that a man said with apparent satisfaction, "Now they are crowning His Majesty." Robespierre apparently heard it. He still had some strength. He opened his eyes. At 9 in the morning on the 28th of July, Robespierre, Saint-Just and Couthon were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The same tribunal Robespierre had helped create. The same procedures he had used against the Girondins, against the Dantonists, against every enemy of the revolution for the past year. The irony is almost too neat to be historically comfortable, which is perhaps why it is also historically true. They were identified. They were declared to be the same people named in the arrest warrant. They were condemned to death. The whole process took minutes. There was no defence. There was no evidence because the law of 22 Prairial, that Robespierre had helped pass the law that eliminated the need for evidence, was still in effect. He had used it to execute 1,400 people in the preceding 7 weeks. It was used on him by lunchtime. In the early evening of the 28th of July, 1794, the carts carrying Robespierre and 21 of his allies moved through Paris toward the Place de la Révolution. The same route, the same square, the same executioner's family. One woman in the crowd stepped forward and struck Robespierre across the face as the cart passed her, screaming that his death was the happiest day she had seen in years. He could not respond. The bullet or the pistol had taken that from him. When the cart arrived at the scaffold, the executioner's assistant tore the bandage from Robespierre's jaw. The wound, which had received minimal treatment overnight, had not been fully cleaned. The removal of the bandage caused what every account of the moment describes as a loud cry, and then the blade fell. The crowd, which had watched 16,000 people die on that scaffold, reportedly applauded for 15 minutes. Something I want to pause on because I think it is easy to read that applause as simple relief or even justice, and miss something more complicated. The people who cheered were in many cases the same people who had cheered the previous executions. The same crowd that had celebrated the fall of the king, the fall of the queen, the fall of Danton, the fall of every prior batch of counter-revolutionaries had now assembled to celebrate the fall of the man who had overseen all of those previous celebrations. The crowd was not cheering for a principle. They were cheering for the end of something that had been frightening them for almost a year. And when the thing that frightens a population is removed, there is always a rush of relief that can look a great deal like justice if you are not paying close attention. The men who actually orchestrated Robespierre's fall, Tallien, Fouché, Baracolo d'Herbois, were not reformers. They were agents of the terror themselves, men who had presided over their own local massacres and who were acting not from principle, but from self-preservation. They were terrified of being Robespierre's next victims. They struck first. Within the following 3 days, the National Convention executed 70 members of the Paris Commune who had sheltered Robespierre. 70 people in 3 days. It was the largest single mass execution in the history of Paris. The guillotine that had dispatched them in one direction dispatched their killers in the other. Here is the thing that I think matters most about the 9th of Thermidor. It is sometimes described as the end of the terror, and in a specific technical sense the winding down of the Committee of Public Safety, the repeal of the law of 22 Prairial, the gradual reopening of the prisons it was. But the system that had made the terror possible did not disappear with Robespierre. The Revolutionary Tribunal continued to operate. The laws allowing arrest without specific evidence continued to exist. The culture of denunciation, the habit of treating suspicion as guilt, the willingness of ordinary people to report on neighbours and colleagues, none of that ended on the 28th of July. What ended was Robespierre. And the men who replaced him, who had done many of the same things and in some cases worse, now had a convenient explanation for everything that had happened, one man's pathological ambition. The terror had not been a system, it had been a person, and the person was gone. This explanation was politically useful and historically dishonest, but it was what France needed to hear in order to move forward, and so it moved forward carrying the dishonesty with it. The door that Robespierre's fall opened did not lead to the republic of virtue he had imagined. it led through 5 more years of instability and faction and economic misery to a short, ambitious general from Corsica who had helped suppress a royalist uprising in Paris, with, as one contemporary dryly described it, a whiff of grape shot. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and his arrival is technically the end of the revolutionary period. But before we reach that moment, before we close the chapter on the revolution itself, there is one more extraordinary chapter in this story, one that involves Notre Dame Cathedral, a woman dressed as a goddess, and the most peculiar attempt in all of revolutionary history to abolish God and replace him with an idea. The revolution had eaten its kings, it had eaten its queens, it had eaten its own founders, and now, in one of its final acts of extraordinary ambition, it tried to eat faith itself. It was built over 200 years. The Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, rising from an island in the Seine, grey and immense and Gothic, in a way that seems to belong to a different order of architecture entirely, as if the stone itself had been persuaded to reach upward rather than simply stacked. Construction began in 1163. By the time the last touches were added around 1260, it had consumed the labour of generations, the ambitions of bishops, and an extraordinary amount of medieval faith in the idea that some things were worth building slowly for the sake of something permanent. For 500 years it stood as the most recognisable symbol of Catholic France. Royal baptisms, royal coronations, the funeral masses of kings. The point from which all distances in France were measured there is a small bronze star embedded in the pavement in front of the cathedral today that marks 0 kilometre, the literal centre of French geography. On the 10th of November 1793 it was renamed the Temple of Reason, and inside, under those soaring Gothic vaults, a woman dressed as a goddess was carried through the doors on a palanquin. Let me explain how France got here, because the dechristianization of the revolution did not happen in a single dramatic gesture. It built over years through a series of decisions and resentments and ideological arguments that eventually produced this extraordinary scene at Notre Dame. The relationship between the Catholic Church and the French Revolution was from the beginning profoundly and mutually hostile. This is worth understanding because the Church was not simply an innocent victim of revolutionary excess. It was also, in the French context, an institution that had accumulated enormous wealth and power over centuries, owning somewhere between 6 and 10% of all land in France, collecting tithes from ordinary people, exempted from taxation, controlling the records of births and deaths and marriages that governed everyone's daily legal life. The revolutionary government's first major act against the Church came in 1790, with the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, a law that essentially nationalised the Church, subordinated it to the state, required priests to swear loyalty oaths to the revolutionary government rather than to Rome, and abolished monasteries. The Pope denounced it. Many priests refused to swear. Those who refused were labelled refractory priests, and as the revolution radicalised, they became targets. By 1793, being a non-juring priest, a priest who had not sworn the revolutionary oath was a capital offence. The massacres in September of 1792 had already claimed the lives of more than 200 priests. Church property was being seized. Church bells were being melted down to make cannon. Even the lead from church coffins was requisitioned for bullets. And then came the dechristianizers. The cult of reason was not Robespierre's invention, in fact he despised it. It was the project of men like Jacques Hébert, Pierre Gaspard Chaumette, and Antoine-François Montmoreau. Radical figures who believed that the revolution's ultimate goal was the eradication of religious faith entirely, to be replaced with the worship of human reason as the supreme principle. The cult of reason was by any reasonable account philosophically incoherent but theatrically spectacular. It took the forms of religion, the ceremonies, the processions, the sacred spaces, the objects of veneration, and replaced their content entirely. Instead of God reason, instead of saints philosophers, instead of liturgy revolutionary songs, and instead of the Virgin Mary a living woman. On the 10th of November 1793, the city of Paris organised what it called the Festival of Reason at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. A papier-mâché mountain had been constructed inside the nave, standing under those Gothic vaults that had been built to inspire awe at something infinite. On top of the mountain sat a small Greek temple with the words "to philosophy" inscribed above its entrance. At the base a flame burned on an altar to reason, and then the central figure arrived. She was carried in on a palanquin that is a kind of covered chair borne by several men normally reserved for royalty and high ceremony. She was dressed in white, wearing the Phrygian bonnet, the cap of liberty that had become the revolution's headgear, and carrying the pike of Jupiter. She was young and by all accounts beautiful. Who exactly she was is still slightly disputed. One version says she was Mademoiselle Maillard, a dancer from the opera. Another credits Thérèse Angélique Aubry. The most detailed accounts point to Sophie Momoro, wife of one of the cult's leading organisers, though the writer Thomas Carlyle, with some 18th century frankness, noted that she made one of the best goddesses of reason, though her teeth were a little defective. I find that detail, the slightly imperfect teeth of the goddess of reason, to be one of the most humanizing observations in the entire revolutionary period. The procession made its way down the long central aisle of Notre Dame to the foot of the papier-mâché mountain. The crowd, many of them wearing revolutionary red bonnets, sang, "Thou holy liberty inhabit this temple, be the goddess of the French nation." The woman at the centre of it, all bowed to the flame of reason, seated herself among flowers and plants at the base of the mountain, then climbed to the Greek temple at the summit and smiled at the assembled crowd. The National Convention attended as a body. The Christian altar had been dismantled. An altar to liberty stood in its place. Above the cathedral doors, where the faithful had passed under the gaze of saints and angels for 500 years, workers had carved in stone a new inscription to philosophy. Now, I want to be honest about something here that often gets lost in accounts of this event. The Festival of Reason at Notre Dame was not universally celebrated even within the Revolution. Many ordinary French people were appalled. Parents refused to send their children to the new civic ceremonies. Attendance at the state services was chronically low across most of France. In many villages, priests who had publicly renounced their faith were quietly asked, sometimes very insistently asked, to continue saying Mass anyway. The Enlightenment had been an intellectual movement. The dechristianization campaign attempted to take those intellectual ideas and impose them on a population that had organized its entire emotional and social life around faith for centuries. You can argue rationally that a belief is incorrect. What you cannot do, it turns out, is simply legislate the need for that belief out of existence. The French countryside, in particular, did not cooperate. And this resistance, quiet, stubborn, sometimes dangerous in the context of the Terror, is one of the reasons the Vendée uprising in the west of France was so passionate and so brutal. Those peasants were not fighting for a king, not really. They were fighting for their saints, their priests, their calendar, their way of marking time and death and birth that the revolution was trying to replace. Robespierre himself understood this in his way. He had philosophers' contempt for what he called the scandalous scenes and wild masquerades of the cult of reason. He was a deist. He believed in a supreme being, in a divine rational order behind the universe, and he found the theatrical atheism of Hébert and Chaumette not just philosophically wrong, but politically dangerous. He had Hébert, Chaumette, Momoro, and their allies arrested in March of 1794. By the end of that month, the founders of the cult of reason had been executed. The cult died with them, or rather it was replaced. What Robespierre put in its place was, depending on your perspective, either more sophisticated or simply more ambitious. The cult of the Supreme Being, officially authorized by the National Convention on the 7th of May 1794, was Robespierre's attempt to solve what he saw as the fundamental problem of governance. How do you maintain a moral, virtuous society without the external enforcement mechanism of religion? His answer was to design one. The Supreme Being was explicitly not the God of Christianity. No Christ, no Virgin, no saints, no sacraments, no clergy, no hierarchy. Just a divine principle, rational, benevolent, existing as the guarantor of the connection between virtue and the soul's immortality. If you behaved virtuously, the Supreme Being would ensure you were rewarded. If you were an enemy of the revolution, you were also an enemy of the Supreme Being, which gave the terror a theological as well as political dimension. What Robespierre was doing, though he would not have framed it this way, was trying to build a religion from scratch using only the philosophical components he approved of, taking the morality and the metaphysics and discarding everything else. The community, the ritual, the particular, the human. Everything that makes a religion feel like home to the people who practice it, rather than just a system of ideas in a book. Predictably, he also appointed himself its chief priest. On the 8th of June 1794, a beautifully sunny day, as if the weather had decided to cooperate, Paris gathered at the Tuileries Gardens for the Festival of the Supreme Being. Across the city, citizens had decorated their homes with oak and laurel wreaths with flowers and tricolour ribbons. The choreography had been designed by the artist Jacques-Louis David, which meant it was visually spectacular and meticulously organised down to the last detail. Robespierre himself arrived dressed in a sky-blue coat and gold trousers, carrying a bouquet of flowers, fruit and grain. He'd been elected president of the National Convention 4 days earlier, conveniently, which meant he was the official presiding figure. He gave the opening speech in the Tuileries Gardens. Then he set fire to a symbolic effigy representing hideous atheism, which burned to reveal an inner statue of wisdom. The crowd then processed through the streets to the Champ de Mars, where David had constructed a massive artificial mountain of timber and plaster, covered with rocks and shrubs and flowers and mirrors. 500,000 people were said to have gathered. A chorus of 2,500 voices sang. The deputies of the convention climbed to the summit and stood beside a liberty tree and swore revolutionary oaths, while La Marseillaise echoed across the field. By almost every account, Robespierre was radiant that day, beaming. This was multiple witnesses observed the happiest day of his life. He'd built something, not just an event, but an idea. The idea that human society could organize itself around virtue without superstition, around reason, without nihilism, around a divine principle without priests. He had for one afternoon everything he had ever wanted. But here is what was also happening during that same procession, and what I think is one of the most revealing details in this entire story. Those watching noticed that as Robespierre led the procession, there was a gap between him and the other deputies, a visible physical space around him, as if the men who walked alongside him had quietly edged backward to create a separation. One contemporary observer named Bodo later wrote, "It seems certain that his downfall was agreed in that triumphal procession. Many were well aware of this, and his opponents made use of it to increase their numbers and convince others of his dictatorship." In other words, while Robespierre was at the summit of the papier-mâché mountain arms, open face lifted toward the sun, presiding over 500,000 people, the men who would kill him 7 weeks later were already planning it. And one deputy, Jacques-Alexis Thuriot, watching from the crowd, leaned toward a companion and whispered, "Look at the bugger. It's not enough for him to be master. He has to be God." The cult of the Supreme Being lasted exactly 6 weeks before the Thermidorian reaction ended it. After Robespierre's execution in late July, the cult disappeared almost immediately. Nobody else wanted to maintain it. It had been too completely the expression of one man's singular vision of what human society should be, and once that man was gone, the vision went with him. Napoleon Bonaparte, when he eventually consolidated power and negotiated his concordat with the Pope in 1801, formally restored Catholicism as the dominant religion of France. The law on cults of 1802 banned both the cult of reason and the cult of the supreme being entirely. Notre Dame became a cathedral again. The inscription "To Philosophy" above the doors was removed. The papier-mâché mountain was long gone. The altar to liberty was dismantled. The thing that strikes me most about this chapter of the Revolution is not the theatrics. It is the desperation underneath them. Think about what the de-Christianization campaign was really trying to do. France had organized its entire social and moral framework around religious institutions for more than 1,000 years. The revolution had dismantled that framework in a matter of months, and now it needed to replace it, needed to answer the questions that religion had always answered. How do we mark birth, death, marriage? What do we owe each other? What makes a life worth living? What happens after? The cult of reason tried to answer those questions with theatre and philosophy. The cult of the supreme being tried to answer them with Robespierre's particular vision of civic virtue. Both failed not because the questions were unanswerable, but because the answers were imposed from above, designed by committees, choreographed by artists, and administered by the same government that was simultaneously sending people to the guillotine. It is very difficult to find spiritual comfort in a religion whose chief priest is also the head of the Committee of Public Safety. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely mean it as a question to sit with rather than something that has an obvious answer. When a society tears down the framework religious, monarchical, social that has organized it for centuries, what does it put in the place of that framework? And how long does it take for the replacement to actually take root, to become something that people feel rather than just comply with? France did not answer that question in 1793 or 1794. It has arguably been working on it ever since. The tension between laïcité, the French principle of strict secular government, and the persistence of faith and tradition in French private life is still very much alive and active in the 21st century. The revolution planted questions that took generations to even begin to answer, and in the middle of all of it, the gods, the guillotines, the ideals, the terror, the revolution was also running out of people to consume. It had eaten its kings, its queens, its founders, its moderate voices, its radical voices. It had tried to eat faith itself. What was left in the autumn of 1794 and beyond was a France that was exhausted, depleted, politically unstable, economically ruined, and desperately in need of something new. This something new arrived from Corsica, riding a wave of military victories with a career built partly on the revolution's chaos and partly on his own extraordinary capacity for the kind of decisive action that the revolution had never quite managed to produce in its civilian governments. His name again was Napoleon, and the story of how he rose from the rubble of everything we've been describing and what he did with it is one of history's most extraordinary case studies in how transformative moments create the conditions for transformative individuals. Before we close this revolution, I want to sit with that story one more time, and I want to talk about what the French Revolution actually left behind for France, for Europe, for us right now, in the world we live in. Because the revolution did not end. Not really. It became the future. We've travelled a long way together, through the frozen markets of 1788 and the thunder of the Bastille's fall, through the 12-mile march in the October rain, and the extraordinary women who walked it, through the machine in the Place de la Révolution and the parade of names that passed beneath it, kings and queens and scientists and idealists and ordinary people, caught in something larger than any individual life. through the papier-mâché mountain in Notre Dame, and the festival on the Champ de Mars and the gap that widens slowly visibly between Robespierre and the men walking behind him. And now we arrive at the end, or rather at the beginning of what the end became. Here is the thing about the French Revolution that I think gets lost when we try to organize it into a story with a tidy conclusion. It did not end. Not in 1794 when the Terror collapsed. Not in 1799 when Napoleon seized power in his coup of the 18th of Brumaire and declared the revolution over. Not in 1815 when the Bourbon monarchy was briefly restored, following Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. Not even in 1848 when France revolted again and again and installed a new republic which then elected Napoleon's nephew, who then declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, which, if you are keeping track, brought France back to roughly where it had started, except now with significantly better record-keeping. The French Revolution did not have a conclusion. It had consequences, and those consequences are still arriving. Let me tell you what the revolution actually left behind. Not the drama, not the guillotine, not the powdered wigs and the papier-mâché gods. What it left behind in the actual structure of the world we live in, the metric system. I know that sounds mundane after everything we've discussed. But consider before the revolution, France alone had something in the region of 800 different units of measurement. A unit of land in Bordeaux was defined by how far a man's voice could carry. A pint of liquid in Paris was a different size from a pint in Saint-Denis 12 miles away. The revolution, driven by the Enlightenment conviction that reason should govern everything, including how you measured a kilogram of grain, created a decimal-based system of universal measurement that could be used identically by every person, in every city, in every country. The metric system became the official system of France in 1799. By 1875, virtually every industrialized nation in the world had adopted it. The United States is today one of the last holdouts, and even there science and medicine use it exclusively. Every time a doctor measures your blood pressure, every time a scientist weighs a compound, every time an engineer calculates a distance, the logic being used was born from the French Revolution's conviction that knowledge should be universal and accessible. The Revolution also produced the Napoleonic Code. The law of France before the Revolution was like its measurement system, a patchwork of local customs and feudal privileges and royal decrees that varied wildly from one region to the next. Napoleon, whatever else one thinks of him, and there is a great deal to think of him, understood that the Revolution's most durable achievement was its legal principles, and in 1804 he compiled those principles into a single, clearly written civil code. The Napoleonic Code abolished feudal privileges. It established equality before the law. It recognized the right to own property. It made civil marriage and divorce secular matters under state rather than church authority. It was, in short, the legal framework of a modern society, and it spread across the world, carried first by Napoleon's armies, then by imitation. It forms the basis of civil law today in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Quebec, Louisiana, and large portions of Latin America. It influenced the legal systems of Japan, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire. The law governing ordinary life for hundreds of millions of people today traces its structure directly back to a code written in the aftermath of the French Revolution. But the Revolution's most important export was not a system of measurement or a legal code. It was an idea, or rather a cluster of ideas about where power comes from, about who governments exist to serve, about what human beings are owed simply by virtue of being born. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, passed in August of 1789, was not the first document to assert human rights. The American Declaration of Independence had made similar claims 13 years earlier. But the French Declaration was different in one crucial way. It was explicitly universal. The American document opened with the phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The French document opened with an assertion about the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man, not French man, not propertied man, not European man. Man. The vision, however imperfectly realized in practice, was planetary. That universalism planted seeds that grew in directions the revolution's architects never anticipated and sometimes actively opposed. In 1791, a former slave named Toussaint Louverture read those ideas or heard them, or felt their logic and recognized them as a challenge to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which was the most profitable sugar-producing territory in the world and was sustained almost entirely by enslaved African labor. The Haitian Revolution, which began in that year and concluded with Haitian independence on the 1st of January 1804, was the only successful slave revolt in history, the first black republic in the world, and it was inspired at least in part by the language that French revolutionaries had used to justify their own uprising. The revolution had proclaimed that all men were free. Haiti said, "Prove it. We will start." The wave did not stop there. Simon Bolivar, who liberated much of South America from Spanish rule in the 1810s and 1820s, explicitly credited the French Revolution as an intellectual framework for his campaigns. The revolutions that swept across Europe in 1848, in France again, but also in Austria, Hungary, Germany, Italy, Poland, were direct echoes of 1789 people demanding constitutions and representative government and the end of aristocratic privilege. The suffrage movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, women demanding the vote, workers demanding representation, colonized peoples demanding independence, all drew language and logic from a revolution that had itself failed to deliver on those promises. Olympe de Gouges had been executed in 1793 for writing a Declaration of the Rights of Woman. But the argument she made did not die with her. It travelled forward in time, finding new voices in new generations until the thing she had demanded for became slowly and imperfectly and incompletely reality in more and more places around the world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, drew directly from the language and concepts of the 1789 Declaration. The modern architecture of international human rights law, the treaties, the courts, the framework by which states are supposed to be held accountable to principles that exist above any single government's preferences, has its deepest roots in that document written by exhausted, frightened, brilliant, flawed people in the summer and autumn of the first year of the French Revolution. Now, a question that I think deserves an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. Was it worth it 17,000 officially executed, 50,000 dead in total, 100,000 or more in the Vendée alone, thousands in the September massacres, the Queen who apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot, the chemist who asked for 2 weeks to finish his experiment, the young journalist who helped light the spark and was consumed by the fire he lit? Was the metric system worth that? Was the Napoleonic Code, was the Declaration of the Rights of Man, however imperfect, however incomplete, however hypocritical in some of its applications? I genuinely do not know how to answer that question. I've thought about it for years, and I think the honest answer is that it is the wrong question. History does not offer us counterfactuals with clean edges. We cannot know what a France without revolution would have looked like, whether reform could have come through other means, whether the suffering could have been avoided while still producing a world that moved toward the ideas the revolution claimed to represent. What we can say is this: the people who suffered were real. Every name on the list of the 17,000 was a person who had a morning and an evening, and people who knew them and things they cared about. The history books tend to make statistics of them, and statistics are easier to think about than people. The women in the marketplace who started October's march were not fighting for the Napoleonic Code. They were fighting for bread. The fishwife who walked 12 miles in the rain was not thinking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She was thinking about her children. The gap between what people fight for in a revolution and what the revolution eventually produces is always enormous. And the people who do the fighting rarely receive what they were promised. I want to leave you with one image, not a grand one, not a famous painting or a dramatic moment at the scaffold. On the night of January 21st, 1793, the night before Louis XVI was executed, the former King of France sat in his cell at the Temple prison and asked to see a priest. He wanted to pray. He wrote letters to his family. He did not sleep. In the morning he rode in a carriage through the streets of Paris for the last time. The crowd lining the route was enormous and largely silent. When the drum stopped just before the end, Louis tried to address the crowd. He said, and these are his recorded words, "People, I die innocent of all the crimes of which I am accused." Whether that was entirely true is a question historians still debate. What is not debatable is the next sentence. He said, "I forgive the authors of my death, and I pray to God that the blood which you are about to shed may never fall upon France." The blood that was about to be shed would fall upon France. A great deal more of it would follow. But Louis XVI, the man who liked making locks and could not figure out how to run a country standing on a scaffold in the January cold, spoke a prayer rather than a condemnation. I've thought about that moment a great deal. Not because I think Louis was heroic, he was not consistently. Not because I think his execution was wrong, that is a more complicated argument than it appears. But because it captures something true about the French Revolution that the broader narrative tends to smooth over. Even at its most terrible, the revolution contained people who were trying. People who believed in something larger than themselves, who were afraid and angry and mistaken, and sometimes monstrous and sometimes genuinely courageous, and who were trying in their particular and limited ways to answer a question that no society had ever successfully answered before. What does it mean for power to belong to the people? They did not get it right. They got it spectacularly, violently, tragically wrong in many ways. But they asked the question in a way that could not be unasked. They planted it in the architecture of the modern world, in its laws and its documents and its language. And every generation since has had to grapple with it imperfectly, stumblingly, with backsliding and betrayal, and occasional terrible regressions, but also with real and cumulative progress. The revolution did not end in 1799. It became the argument that every democracy since has been having with itself. And that, I think, is where we leave Paris. Not at the guillotine, not at the papier-mâché mountain, not in the rain on the road to Versailles. We leave it at the question, standing in the rubble of the old world asking what comes next, knowing that the answer will be complicated, knowing that good intentions are not enough, knowing that the people who are most certain they are right are often the most dangerous. Knowing that the women who walk 12 miles in the mud sometimes change more history than the men who write the speeches. Knowing that every society, including ours right now, is still working out what it means to actually mean the things it claims to believe. Thank you. I mean that genuinely and without ceremony. You have spent hours in this darkness with me, following the story of a city that tore itself apart and put something new in the wreckage. That is not a small thing to give your attention, your quiet, your willingness to sit with a complicated and painful and extraordinary chapter of human experience before you sleep. I hope it travels with you in whatever way history travels, not as facts to be memorized, but as texture. A feeling for the weight of what ordinary people carry when the world they know is falling apart and the world to come has not yet arrived. If this story found a place in you, I would love to know. Drop something in the comments, a thought, a question, a moment from this journey that stayed with you. Or tell me where in the world you listened from tonight. I read everyone, And if you want to make sure you catch the next story when it arrives, and there are many more stories waiting from other cities and other centuries, and other extraordinary moments when everything changed, the subscribe button is right there. It costs nothing. It means a great deal. Sleep well. The story is not over. It never is. It just moves on to the next chapter.